Mason Thorne's shovel struck the frozen ground with a dull thud. Each strike sent pain shooting through his arms, but he didn't stop. The grave needed to be deeper. Montana winters were unforgiving. The animals would dig if he didn't go down far enough. Sweat froze on his brow despite the bitter cold that turned his breath into ghost-like wisps in the moonlight. From the small horse-drawn cart behind him, a pair of dark eyes watched. The Apache woman lay still, her lower body covered with a worn wool blanket. Despite her weakness, her gaze remained alert, calculating. She hadn't spoken a word since he'd brought her here, but her eyes followed his every movement, assessing him as he dug into the unforgiving earth. The wind howled across the valley, carrying the promise of more snow. Mason paused, leaning on the shovel, his scarred face illuminated by the lantern hanging from the cart. The deep gash that ran from his right temple to his jaw was a reminder of another life, another time. He looked at the woman, their eyes meeting briefly. No fear in her gaze, only wariness and something else, a stubborn will to survive. "Won't be much longer," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She didn't respond, but her eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to decipher whether his words were a promise or a threat. 3 days earlier, Mason had ridden into town for supplies. Winter was setting in, and his mother's cough had worsened. Eleanor Thorne needed medicine. The willow bark tea wasn't helping anymore. The small trading post on the edge of Mason's Valley was the closest thing to civilization for 20 miles in any direction. Mason didn't like town. Too many eyes, too many whispers. Even after 5 years of living peacefully in the valley, people still recognized him as Captain Mason Thorne, the Army detective who had hunted deserters with ruthless efficiency during the war between the states. The scar on his face made him impossible to forget, even if he wished otherwise. He tied his horse outside the general store and adjusted his hat lower over his face. Inside, the store was warm, the scent of coffee, leather, and tobacco hanging in the air. Mr. Donovan, the store owner, nodded in greeting. "Thorne, been a while." Mason placed a list on the counter. "Need these and laudanum if you've got it." Donovan's bushy eyebrows rose. "Your mother worse?" Mason just stared, his gray eyes giving nothing away. "Right," Donovan muttered, gathering the items. "Heard about a group of settlers had trouble west of here. Apache, they said. Lost a wagon and 2 men. Mason didn't respond. The troubles between settlers and natives weren't his concern. He'd seen enough blood in the war to last a lifetime. As Donovan counted out coffee beans, a commotion outside drew Mason's attention. Through the frosted window, he saw 3 men dragging someone, from the back of a wagon. They moved with the casual cruelty of men handling cargo they considered worthless. "What's happening?" Mason asked, his voice low. Donovan glanced up, then shrugged. "That'll be the Blackwell party. Came in this morning from the South Trail. Said they caught an Apache woman during the raid. Not much use to them now, from what I hear. She can't walk." Something cold settled in Mason's stomach. He paid for his supplies and stepped outside, keeping to the shadows of the store's porch. The men had dumped a woman behind the livery stable, leaving her sprawled in the dirt like discarded freight. Her long black hair hung in tangled ropes, and her leather dress was torn in places that exposed her skin to the biting cold. Her legs lay awkwardly, unmoving. The men walked away toward the saloon, laughing among themselves. No one in the street intervened. A stable boy peeked out, then quickly returned to his work. The town had made its silent judgment. The Apache woman was not their concern. Mason stood frozen, his hand tightening on his supply bag. This wasn't his fight. He had his own burdens, a dying mother, a past full of ghosts. Getting involved would only bring trouble down on them both. He turned away, loaded his supplies onto his horse, and rode out of town without looking back. But the image of the woman stayed with him, a persistent shadow on his conscience. The cabin was silent when he returned, save for the crackling of the fire and his mother's labored breathing. Eleanor Thorne sat in her rocking chair, wrapped in quilts despite the warmth of the room. Once a formidable woman who had crossed the frontier alone after being widowed, she was now thin as a winter reed, her once bright eyes clouded with cataracts. "You're back," she said, her head turning toward the sound of his boots. "Did you get the medicine?" "Yes." Mason placed a small bottle on the table beside her. 2 drops in water, not more. She nodded, her gnarled fingers finding the bottle with practiced ease. Something's troubling you. Mason paused in unpacking the supplies. His mother had always read him too well, even now that her eyes failed her. Nothing important. He hung his coat on a peg. Town's the same. Donovan sends his regards. Eleanor's face softened into a knowing smile. You never were much of a liar, Mason, not to me. He sighed, sitting down heavily on a chair across from here. There was a woman, Apache. They left her behind the livery like trash. Who did? Settlers. Blackwell's group, Donovan said. Claimed they caught her in a raid. She's crippled, can't walk. They just left her there. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers working at the edge of her quilt. And you did nothing. It wasn't a question, and Mason didn't answer. There was no defense he could offer that would satisfy either of them. She'll die out there, Eleanor said simply. It's not our concern. Eleanor's cloudy eyes somehow found his face. Isn't it? What did I raise you to be, Mason Thorne? A survivor, he answered, his voice hardening. We have enough trouble without inviting more. Surviving isn't the same as living. She coughed, a deep rattling sound that shook her frail body. When the spell passed, she continued more softly. You've been hiding in this valley for 5 years, running from what you did in the war. Maybe it's time you remembered the man you were before they turned you into a hunter. Mason stood abruptly, moving to stoke the fire. That man is gone. No, and Eleanor's voice was surprisingly firm. He's just lost. Perhaps saving someone else might help you find him again. Mason didn't respond, but her words burrowed deep, finding the hollow place inside him that had been empty since Gettysburg, since the farmhouse, since the family that had died because of his mistake. After midnight, Mason saddled his horse again. He told himself he was only going to check. Maybe someone else had already helped the woman. Maybe she was already dead. Either way, he'd know, and perhaps then the image of her lying in the dirt would stop haunting him. The town was silent when he arrived, a few oil lamps glowing dimly in windows. He left his horse at the edge of town and approached the livery on foot, moving with the silence that had once made him the Army's best tracker. She was still there, curled on her side now, one arm tucked under her head. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Frost had formed on her hair and the torn edges of her dress. How she had survived the cold night was a testament to either incredible strength or stubborn defiance of death. Mason crouched beside her, his lantern casting a soft glow over her face. She was younger than he'd thought, perhaps in her 20s. Her features were strong, high cheekbones and a straight nose, lips cracked from cold and thirst. Bruises darkened her arms where rough hands had gripped her. He checked her legs, gently probing for breaks. No fresh injuries, but there was an old wound, perhaps a fall or a blow that had damaged her spine. When he touched her calf, there was no response. But when his fingers brushed higher on her thigh, he noticed a slight, almost imperceptible twitch of muscle. Interesting. The damage might not be complete. He dampened a cloth with water from his flask and touched it to her lips. After a moment, she swallowed reflexively, her eyelids fluttering. Then suddenly they snapped open, dark eyes locking onto his face with startling awareness. She didn't move, didn't cry out. She simply stared at him, assessing the threat he might pose. Her breathing quickened slightly, but she showed remarkable control. I'm taking you out of here, Mason said, his voice low and even. Don't fight. I can't carry dead weight. She watched his mouth, head tilting slightly, as if trying to understand his words. Her fingers twitched once in the dirt, but she didn't resist when he slid his arms beneath her, one across her back, the other under her knees. She was lighter than he expected, her body cold where the dress was torn, but still warm at the core. When he lifted her, she grabbed his coat collar, not in fear but for stability. Her torn dress shifted against his chest as he carried her to his horse, the skin of her exposed shoulder ice cold to the touch. Mounting with her was awkward, but he managed, positioning her sideways across the saddle in front of him. He wrapped his coat around her as best he could, shielding her from the wind that had picked up. They rode in silence, the woman's head eventually coming to rest against his shoulder as exhaustion overcame her vigilance. The cabin was warm when they returned, the fire still burning low in the hearth. Eleanor had fallen asleep in her chair, her breathing labored but steady. Mason carried the woman to the small cot near the stove and laid her down carefully. As he arranged blankets around her, he noticed a mark on her arm, a tattoo he hadn't seen in the darkness of the town. It was a simple design of three interlocking triangles, but Mason recognized it immediately. It was the mark of the Red Sun Apache, one of the most feared warrior tribes in the territory. The woman wasn't just any Apache, she belonged to the tribe that had repeatedly defied army efforts to confine them to reservations. This complicated things considerably. He was still processing this discovery when a flash of movement caught his eye. The woman's hand darted to her hair, pulling free a small bone knife hidden in her braids. Despite her weakened state, she slashed at him with surprising speed. Mason caught her wrist easily, his reflexes honed by years of combat. He didn't twist or hurt her, simply held her arm immobilized. Then, to her evident shock, he spoke in halting Apache. "I am not your enemy." His accent was terrible, the words clumsy but recognizable. Her eyes widened, the knife trembling in her grip. Mason slowly released her wrist and stepped back, showing his empty palms. "Where did you learn our tongue?" she asked in English, her voice hoarse but clear. It was Mason's turn to be surprised. "Army, scouts taught me." He switched back to English. "You speak well." "Missionaries," she replied tersely, the knife still clutched in her hand. "Why did you bring me here?" Before Mason could answer, Eleanor's voice came from behind him. "Because leaving you to die would have been wrong." His mother was awake, her head turned toward the sound of their voices. "Put away your knife, child. If we meant you harm, we wouldn't have brought you to our home." The woman stared at Eleanor, then at Mason, her expression guarded. Slowly, she lowered the knife but kept it in her grip. "I am Eleanor Thorne," his mother continued, her voice gentle. "This is my son, Mason. May we know your name?" The woman hesitated, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she said, "Nayeli." Eleanor smiled. "Welcome to our home, Nayeli. You're safe here." Mason wasn't so sure about that. A Red Sun Apache in his cabin was about as far from safe as he could imagine. But he held his tongue, watching as his mother somehow managed to put the warrior woman at ease with nothing but her voice and presence. Eleanor directed Mason to heat water and prepare a broth. While he worked, she spoke softly to Nayeli, asking about her injuries, her needs. The easy way his mother conversed with the Apache woman surprised him. There was a familiarity in her tone that suggested more knowledge of native ways than he had realized she possessed. "How long have I been gone?" Nayeli asked suddenly. "From my people." "I don't know," Eleanor answered honestly. "How were you taken?" Nayeli's face hardened. "Raid. Men with guns came at dawn. They killed 3, took me. I fought but fell from the horse. After I couldn't walk, they had no use for me." Her hand moved to her legs, covered by the blanket. "They said I would fetch no price as a slave or wife." Mason's jaw tightened at the casual cruelty. Slave trade was illegal but still practiced in remote territories, particularly with Native women. That the Blackwell Party had been so open about their intentions suggested powerful protection. Eleanor reached out, somehow finding Nayeli's hand despite her poor vision. "You're not property here. You're a guest." "Why?" Nayeli asked, looking directly at Mason now. "Why help me?" Mason set a cup of broth on the small table beside the cot. "Drink this first, then we'll talk." While Nayeli drank, Mason took his mother aside. "She's Red Sun Apache," he whispered. "Do you understand what that means? If her people come looking, they will find that we helped one of their own," Eleanor interrupted. "Is that so terrible?" "It could be. Red Sun has been at war with settlers for years." Eleanor's cloudy eyes somehow found his face. "And who started that war, I wonder? The people who lived here for generations, or those who came to take their land?" Mason sighed. His mother had always held unconventional views about the native tribes. "This isn't about right or wrong. It's about surviving." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "It's about doing what's right despite the risk. That's how we survive as humans, not just as bodies drawing breath." She coughed, the deep rattling sound that had become more frequent lately. "Besides, I know more about the Apache than you might think." Before Mason could question this cryptic statement, Eleanor turned back toward Nayeli. "You must be exhausted, child. Rest now. We can speak more in the morning." Nayeli had finished the broth, her eyelids growing heavy, despite her evident desire to remain alert. The warmth, food, and relative safety were overwhelming her warrior's discipline. "I will watch," Mason said in Apache, surprising himself as much as Nayeli. "Sleep without fear." Her dark eyes met his one last time, still wary but now tinged with confusion at his unexpected kindness. Then finally she surrendered to exhaustion, her hands still gripping the small bone knife as she slept. Mason watched her for a long moment, wondering what chain of events he had set in motion by bringing her here. Then he helped his mother to her bed in the small back room and settled himself in a chair by the door, rifle across his lap. He would indeed watch through the night, though whether he was guarding Nayeli from outside threats or guarding his household from her remained unclear even to himself. Dawn brought a pale light filtering through the cabin's shuttered windows. Mason had dozed off in his chair sometime before sunrise, his chin resting on his chest. He woke instantly at the sound of movement, his hand tightening on the rifle. Nayeli was awake, pushing herself up on her elbows to look around the cabin. Her gaze landed on him, alert and cautious. "Morning, Beran," Mason said, setting aside the rifle to show he meant no threat. "Hungry?" She nodded once, her eyes never leaving his face. While Mason built up the fire and set water to boil for coffee and porridge, she studied the cabin, taking in every detail, every potential weapon, every escape route. The assessment of a warrior, not a victim. "Your mother," Nayeli said finally. "She is very ill." It wasn't a question, but Mason answered anyway. "Yes, her lungs are failing. She is a strange white woman. She speaks to me as a person." Mason stirred the porridge. "My mother has her own views about the world." "And you? What are your views, Mason Thorne?" The direct question caught him off guard. He turned to face her fully, noting how she had managed to arrange herself into a more dignified position, her back straight despite her infirmity. "My views don't matter much," he said finally. "I keep to myself." "Yet you took me from that place." Her eyes were piercing, demanding honesty. "Wipa," Mason considered several answers before settling on the truth. "Because I couldn't walk away again." Something in his tone must have resonated with her, because she nodded slowly, as if hearing more than his words. "You have walked away before, from something important." The perception was uncomfortably accurate. Before he could respond, Eleanor's voice called from the back room. "Mason, is that coffee I smell?" He helped his mother to her rocking chair by the fire, noting how much effort each step cost her. Eleanor's illness was progressing faster than he wanted to admit. When she was settled, her face lit up at the sight of Nayeli awake and alert. "You look better this morning," she said warmly. "Has my son been hospitable?" "He has not tried to kill me," Nayeli replied with surprising dryness. "For a white man, that is hospitable." Eleanor laughed, a sound that transformed into another coughing fit. When it subsided, she wiped her mouth with a handkerchief, hiding the flecks of blood from Mason's view, but not quickly enough. "You need medicine," he said, pouring her a cup of coffee with 2 drops of laudanum. "What I need is to know our guest is comfortable," Eleanor countered, taking the cup. "Nayeli, can you tell us more about your injuries? My son said your legs don't respond, but perhaps we can help ease your discomfort." Nayeli's hand moved to her thigh, pressing down. "I fell from a horse during the raid. Something broke inside. I cannot feel or move below here." She indicated a point midway down her thighs. "May I?" Eleanor asked, gesturing toward Nayeli's legs. After a moment's hesitation, Nayeli nodded. Eleanor handed her coffee to Mason and moved to the cot, her hands finding Nayeli's legs with careful, gentle movements. Despite her failing eyesight, Eleanor's fingers were sensitive and knowing. She probed certain points, asking Nayeli about sensation and pain. "The damage is to your spine," she said finally. "But it may not be permanent. I've seen injuries like this before. Sometimes feeling returns, sometimes not. But we can work to keep your muscles from wasting." Nayeli's expression remained neutral, but Mason caught the flash of hope in her eyes. "You have knowledge of healing?" "Some," Eleanor said, returning to her chair. "Long ago, I spent time with a healer who taught me many things." Mason frowned. This was news to him. His mother had rarely spoken of her life before he was born, and never mentioned studying medicine. "I will show you exercises," Eleanor continued. "Mason will help. He has strong hands, good for massage." Mason nearly choked on his coffee. Mother, don't mother me, Eleanor cut him off with a wave. The girl needs proper care if she's to have any chance of recovery. You brought her here, now you'll help her heal. The stern tone brooked no argument. Mason sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of his mother's jaw. When Eleanor Thorne made up her mind, not even the Montana winter could change it. First, Eleanor said, she needs proper clothes. That dress is torn beyond repair. Mason, bring my trunk. Mason did as asked, bringing the old cedar trunk from the back room. Eleanor directed him to remove a simple cotton dress and woolen shawl. It's not fancy, but it's warm and whole, she said. Mason, go outside and bring more firewood. I'll help Nayeli change. He recognized the dismissal and stepped outside, grateful for the cold air that cleared his head. The situation was growing more complicated by the hour. His mother seemed determined to nurse Nayeli back to health, regardless of the potential consequences. And those consequences could be severe if the Blackwell Party discovered where their property had gone, or if Red Sun warriors came looking for their missing tribeswoman. Mason spent longer than necessary chopping wood, giving the women time. When he returned, Nayeli was dressed in his mother's old clothes, her hair combed and braided neatly. The dress was too large, but Eleanor had cinched it with a belt. The transformation was striking. Nayeli looked less like a wounded animal and more like the proud warrior she clearly was. Better, Eleanor declared. Now, Mason, you'll need to build a proper chair for Nayeli. Something with support for her back, but that keeps her upright. Lying too long will weaken her further. Mason wanted to protest the growing list of tasks, but couldn't bring himself to refuse. Instead, he spent the day measuring, cutting, and assembling a chair with a high back and arms that would allow Nayeli to sit without straining. He built it lower than normal, so she could be moved to and from it more easily. While he worked, he could hear Eleanor and Nayeli talking inside the cabin. His mother was teaching Nayeli English words she didn't know, while Nayeli corrected Eleanor's pronunciation of Apache terms. The easy rapport between them was puzzling. It was as if Eleanor had been waiting for this opportunity, this connection to a culture she seemingly knew more about than she had ever revealed. By evening, the chair was complete. Mason carried it inside and placed it near the fire. Nayeli watched with those ever-observant eyes as he explained how it would work. I will lift you into it, he said, speaking slowly and clearly. It will be better for your back than lying all day. Nayeli nodded her understanding. When Mason moved to lift her, she tensed briefly, then forced herself to relax. He was careful, one arm behind her back, the other under her knees, lifting her in a smooth motion to minimize discomfort. Her body was warmer now, no longer chilled from exposure, and he could feel the strength in her upper body despite her injury. Once seated, Nayeli's posture straightened, her chin lifting with dignity. The change in position clearly brought her relief, allowing her to observe the cabin from a more commanding perspective. She ran her hands over the carefully sanded arms of the chair, nodding approval. Good work, she said simply. It was the first direct compliment she had offered, and Mason found himself oddly pleased by it. He nodded acknowledgement and returned to preparing their evening meal. That night, as snow began to fall outside, the three of them sat in a strange but not uncomfortable silence. Eleanor dozed in her rocking chair, her breathing labored. Nayeli watched the flames in the fireplace, her face revealing nothing of her thoughts. Mason cleaned his rifle, a habit from his army days that brought familiar comfort. You were a soldier, Nayeli said suddenly, breaking the silence. Mason's hands paused on the weapon. Yes. Against the southern tribes? No, different war. Americans fighting Americans. Nayeli's brow furrowed. Why would a people fight themselves? It was a profound question that Mason had asked himself many times. Some believed men could own other men. Some didn't. Ah, Nayeli nodded. Slavery. We have heard of this. My father says white men bring strange ideas about owning what cannot be owned. People, land, water. Your father? Nayeli seemed to realize she had revealed more than intended. Her expression closed again. A man of my tribe. Mason suspected there was more to it but didn't press. Instead, he asked, where is your tribe now? The Red Sun camp in winter? Her eyes narrowed at his recognition of her tribal affiliation. You know my people? I know the mark, he said, nodding toward the tattoo on her arm. Three triangles of the red sun. Army keeps track of such things. Nayeli unconsciously touched the tattoo. My tribe moves with the seasons. They will be in the southern valleys now, where snow is less deep. Her voice softened. They think I am dead. The simple statement held volumes of loss. Mason understood suddenly that Nayeli's stoicism masked a deep grief, not just for her physical condition, but for the life and people torn from her. If you could send a message, he said carefully, would you want to? Hope flared briefly in her eyes, then dimmed. How? I cannot travel, and no white man would willingly approach Red Sun Camp. There are traitors, Indians who move between worlds. If I knew where to find them— No, Nayeli cut him off firmly. It is too dangerous. For them, for you. If Blackwell's men learned you helped me— She shook her head. Better they think me dead for now. Her practical assessment impressed Mason. She was thinking strategically, not emotionally, despite her situation. The mark of a warrior raised in a hostile world. Rest, he said finally, returning to his rifle. Tomorrow we will start the exercises my mother mentioned. For your legs. Nayeli watched him a moment longer, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Then she nodded and settled back in the chair, her vigilance never fully subsiding, even as exhaustion claimed her. Later that night, as Mason helped her back to the cot and covered her with blankets, she caught his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Thank you, she said, the words clearly unfamiliar on her tongue when directed at a white man. For the chair. For the medicine. Mason nodded once, uncomfortable with gratitude. Sleep well, Nayeli. She released him, her eyes closing. Mason watched her a moment longer, then checked on his mother. Eleanor's breathing was worse, the rattle in her chest more pronounced. The laudanum helped with the pain, but could do nothing to stop the progression of her disease. He adjusted her blankets, a heaviness settling in his chest at the knowledge that he was losing her, one breath at a time. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the valley in pristine white. Inside the cabin, an unlikely trio sheltered against the gathering winter. A dying woman with mysterious knowledge, a broken warrior with hidden strength, and a man haunted by his past, all bound together by circumstance and choices that would soon prove fateful for them all. The next morning brought clearer weather but colder temperatures. Mason rose before dawn, stoked the fire, and checked on his mother. Eleanor was sleeping fitfully, her breath shallow. The disease was progressing faster now, stealing more of her strength each day. He adjusted her blankets and left her to rest. Nayeli was already awake, her eyes following him as he moved about the cabin. There was less suspicion in her gaze now, replaced by careful observation. She had propped herself up on one elbow, and Mason noticed how she kept testing her other hand against the blanket, pressing down as if searching for sensation. You should try to move them, he said, nodding toward her legs. Even if they don't respond, keep the blood flowing. Nayeli's eyebrows rose slightly at his knowledge. Your mother said the same. Mason prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal porridge, adding the last of their dried berries for flavor. He helped Nayeli into the chair, noting how she used her arm strength to assist in the transfer, already adapting to her condition. They ate in companionable silence until Eleanor joined them, moving slowly with Mason's help. Her face was pale, with spots of unnatural color high on her cheekbones. You have fever, Nayeli said immediately, her eyes assessing Eleanor with concern. Eleanor waved off the observation. It comes and goes. Today we focus on you. Mason, after breakfast, you'll help Nayeli with the exercises I showed her yesterday. Mason nodded, though the thought of handling Nayeli's legs made him uncomfortable. It seemed too intimate a task for two virtual strangers bound by unusual circumstances. After breakfast, Eleanor supervised as Mason carefully manipulated Nayeli's legs, bending and straightening them to keep the muscles from atrophy. Nayeli watched intently, her face betraying no pain or discomfort, though the process couldn't have been pleasant. Press here, Eleanor directed, guiding Mason's hands to specific points on Nayeli's calves and thighs. Like kneading bread, it helps the blood flow. Mason followed instructions, his strong hands working the muscles with gentle pressure. Nayeli remained stoic, but he noticed how she watched his every movement, studying the technique as if planning to continue it herself when possible. Good, Eleanor said after several minutes. Now help her stand. Stand? Mason looked up in surprise. But she can't. Not alone, no. But her body needs to remember the position. It will help if feeling returns. Nayeli's eyes had brightened at the suggestion. Yes, she said firmly. I want to try to. Mason positioned himself in front of Nayeli's chair, taking her hands in his. Put your arms around my neck, he instructed. I'll lift and hold you steady. Nayeli hesitated only briefly before complying. Mason counted to 3, then lifted her in one smooth motion, supporting her weight as her feet touched the floor. Her legs couldn't bear weight, but with his support, she was upright, her face suddenly level with his chest. The proximity was startling for both of them. Mason could feel the strength in her arms as she clung to his shoulders, the warmth of her breath against his neck. Her dark eyes were wide, not with fear, but with determination in something else. The simple human pleasure of being upright after days of horizontal helplessness. Hold her there, Eleanor instructed. Count slowly to 20. Mason did as told, acutely aware of Nayeli's body against his, her weight supported by his arms around her waist. Despite her condition, there was nothing frail about her. Her upper body was toned and strong from a lifetime of physical activity. 19, 20, Mason finished. Ready to sit again? Nayeli nodded, though he caught a flash of reluctance in her expression. He lowered her carefully back into the chair, their eyes meeting briefly as he stepped away. Something had shifted between them in that moment of necessary intimacy. Not romantic, but a human connection forged through vulnerability and trust. We'll do that twice more today, Eleanor said, seemingly unaware of the charged moment. And every day after. The rest of the morning passed in domestic routine. Mason went outside to care for the livestock and check his trap lines, leaving Nayeli and Eleanor talking by the fire. When he returned hours later, cheeks reddened from the cold, he found Nayeli with a needle and thread, mending one of his shirts with neat, precise stitches. Your shirt had holes, she explained, not looking up from her work. I fix. Mason hung his coat by the door, strangely touched by the gesture. Thank you. Your mother taught me words while you were gone, Nayeli continued. She knows many things, strange things for a white woman. Before Mason could inquire further, a sound outside caught his attention. The approach of hooves moving at a steady pace through the snow. He moved to the window, hand automatically reaching for his rifle. A single rider approached the cabin, the horse picking its way carefully along the trail Mason had broken earlier. The man wore a heavy coat and a badge that caught the winter sunlight. Who is it? Eleanor asked, hearing the change in Mason's breathing. Sheriff Locke, Mason replied grimly. Samuel Locke had been a lieutenant in the same regiment where Mason served as a captain. Their history was complicated, not enemies, not friends, but bound by shared experiences they'd both rather forget. Take Nayeli to the back room, he instructed his mother. Stay quiet. Eleanor nodded, understanding the potential danger. Mason helped Nayeli to the bed in the small back room, closing the door behind them just as a knock sounded at the cabin's entrance. Mason opened the door, keeping his expression neutral. Locke. Sheriff Samuel Locke stood on the porch, snow dusting his broad shoulders. At 45, he was still an imposing figure, his face weathered by sun and wind, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. Thorne, he nodded. Been a while. What brings you out this way? Mason asked, not inviting him in. Locke's gaze moved past him, scanning what he could see of the cabin's interior. Heard about your mother. Thought I'd check how she's doing. It was a plausible excuse, but Mason knew better. News traveled fast in small territories, and Locke hadn't ridden all this way in winter just for courtesy. She's resting, Mason said. Been a bad night. Locke nodded, then got to the point. Also heard you were in town 2 days ago. Donovan mentioned you asking about a particular situation behind the livery. Mason kept his face carefully blank. Donovan talks too much. That he does. Locke studied Mason's face, reading what he could. The Blackwell party is making noise about missing property. Valuable property, they say. I wouldn't know anything about that. Locke's mouth twitched, almost a smile. No, I expect you wouldn't, not officially. He sighed, breath forming clouds in the cold air. Look, Mason, I'm not here to make trouble, but you should know Oliver Blackwell isn't just another settler. He's got connections in the territorial government, money behind him. He's pushing a railroad deal that would open up this whole valley to development. Mason's jaw tightened. This valley is my land, legal and proper. For now, Locke agreed, but things change fast out here. New laws, new boundaries, especially when natives are involved. The implication was clear. Helping an Apache woman could be used against him if Blackwell wanted his land. Is that a threat, Samuel? Mason asked quietly. Locke shook his head, a warning from one soldier to another. Whatever you've gotten yourself into, be careful. Blackwell's not the forgiving type. Before Mason could respond, the door to the back room opened and Eleanor emerged. Her timing was deliberate, Mason knew. She had been listening. Sheriff Locke, she called, her voice stronger than it had been in days. Don't stand out there freezing. Come in and have coffee. Locke removed his hat, nodding respectfully. Mrs. Thorne, you're looking well. It was a kind lie. Eleanor looked terrible, her skin waxy and her frame diminished beneath her shawl. But she carried herself with dignity as she made her way to her rocking chair. Coffee, Mason, she prompted, and Mason reluctantly moved to the stove, allowing Locke to enter. The sheriff stepped inside, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the cabin. Mason knew he was looking for signs of their guest, but there was nothing visible. Nayeli's chair was just a chair. Her cot could be anyone's. How's the winter treating you, Mrs. Thorne? Locke asked, accepting the cup Mason begrudgingly offered. Cold as ever, Eleanor replied. But we manage. How is Martha? Still baking those wonderful pies for the jail? Locke smiled genuinely at the mention of his wife. She is, says the prisoners behave better when they're well fed. Smart woman, and Eleanor's tone was conversational, but Mason recognized her strategy, reminding Locke of his humanity, his connections to normal life beyond his badge. Now, Eleanor continued, what really brings you to our door in this weather, Sheriff? I doubt it's concern for an old woman's health. Locke chuckled, appreciating her directness. No, ma'am, it's a delicate matter. He glanced at Mason, then back to Eleanor. There's been trouble with the Red Sun Apache, raids on settlements, missing livestock. And now Blackwell's party claims they lost someone they acquired during a confrontation. Acquired, Eleanor repeated, her tone making the euphemism sound obscene. You mean kidnapped? Locke shifted uncomfortably. The territorial governor has authorized certain actions against hostile tribes. Blackwell operates within those parameters. Parameters that allow the taking of women? Eleanor's voice was steel beneath silk. Is that the law you uphold, Sheriff? Mason watched the exchange with growing admiration for his mother's tactical mind. She was putting Locke on the defensive, making him justify actions he might not personally condone. I uphold the peace, Mrs. Thorne, Locke said carefully, which is why I'm here. If someone were to interfere with Blackwell's operations, it could escalate tensions. The Army's already positioning for a spring campaign against Red Sun. And one woman would change that how? Eleanor challenged. Locke sighed. It's not about the woman. It's about Blackwell's pride and influence. He's not a man who accepts defiance. Neither is my son, Eleanor said simply. The statement hung in the air, neither confirmation nor denial of Mason's involvement, but a clear indication of where she stood. Locke nodded slowly, understanding. I see. He finished his coffee and stood. Well, I should get back before dark. Weather's turning again. Mason walked him to the door where Locke paused, speaking low so Eleanor couldn't hear. Whatever you're doing, Mason, be careful. Blackwell's men were tracking something to the edge of town. Won't be long before they follow the trail here. Let them come, Mason said quietly. They'll find this is still my land. Locke studied him for a long moment. You've changed since the war. Time was, you wouldn't risk yourself for anyone, let alone an Apache. Maybe I'm remembering who I was before, Mason replied, echoing his mother's words. Locke nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. For what it's worth, I always thought you got a raw deal after Gettysburg. What happened to that family wasn't your fault. The mention of Gettysburg sent a cold spike through Mason's chest. That's not how I remember it. Memory's a tricky thing. Locke put on his hat. Good day, Thorne. Give my regards to your mother. Mason watched him ride away, the horse's hoofprints marking a clear trail through the snow, a trail others could follow. They would need to be vigilant now. The confrontation was coming, whether they were ready or not. When the sheriff was out of sight, Mason returned to the back room. Nayeli was sitting up on the bed, her back straight, face composed. But he could see tension in the set of her shoulders. "He suspects," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Mason admitted, "but he won't act against us, not directly. Others will come." "Yes," Nayeli's dark eyes held his. "I bring danger to your home, to your mother." Mason shook his head. Danger was always here. This valley, this life, nothing is certain. He helped her back to the main room where Eleanor waited with a knowing expression. "The sheriff is a better man than his position allows him to be," Eleanor observed. "But he's right about one thing. Blackwell won't stop looking." "Then we prepare," Mason said simply. That afternoon, he began reinforcing the cabin's defenses. He checked and cleaned his weapons, the rifle, a shotgun, and the Army Colt revolver he'd carried through the war. He moved firewood and supplies inside, enough to last through a siege if necessary. Nayeli watched his preparations with understanding eyes. When he brought in the last armload of wood, she said, "Teach me to shoot." Mason paused, surprised by the request. "Your legs." "My arms are strong," she interrupted. "If they come, I will not be helpless." He considered refusing, then recognized the determination in her expression. She was a warrior, injured but not defeated. Denying her the means to defend herself would be another kind of cruelty. The pistol, he decided, lighter than the rifle, easier to handle from sitting position. Over the next hour, he taught her the basics of the Colt, how to load, aim, and fire. Her hands were steady and sure, quickly mastering the mechanics. Her aim would need practice, but her instincts were good. "You learn quickly," Mason observed as she reloaded the weapon for the third time. "My father taught me bow from age 5, Nayeli said, a rare personal detail. He said, "In this world, a woman must be twice as deadly as a man to be respected half as much." "Your father sounds wise." A small smile touched her lips, gone almost before it formed. "He is, and terrible in his anger." That evening, as snow began to fall again outside, Eleanor's condition worsened. Her cough became more frequent, each spell leaving her weaker than before. Mason doubled the dose of laudanum, knowing it was dangerous but unable to bear her suffering. While she slept fitfully in her rocking chair, Mason and Nayeli sat by the fire in a companionable silence, broken only by the crackling of flames and Eleanor's labored breathing. The day's events had accelerated their unusual bond, creating a tentative trust neither had expected. "Your mother is dying," Nayeli said finally, her voice gentle but direct. "You know this." Mason nodded, his eyes fixed on the fire. "The doctor in town said last winter would be her last. She's stronger than they thought." "She stays for you," Nayeli observed. "She fears leaving you alone." The insight struck closer to home than Mason wanted to admit. "Perhaps. Among my people, we prepare for death. We speak of it openly, so the spirit is ready for the journey." Nayeli's voice softened. "Has she told you what she wants after?" Mason shook his head. "We don't speak of it. You should before it is too late." The simple wisdom in her words penetrated the armor Mason had built around his grief. He looked at his mother, seeing clearly how much she had diminished, how little time remained. The thought of the cabin without her was a hollow pain he had been avoiding for too long. "Thank you," he said quietly to Nayeli, "for seeing what I could not." She nodded once, understanding in her eyes. Then unexpectedly, she reached across the space between them and placed her hand on his. The gesture was brief, a simple human connection, but it carried more comfort than any words could have provided. As midnight approached, Mason helped Nayeli to her cot and checked on his mother. Eleanor was awake, her eyes clearer than they had been all day. "Sit with me," she said, patting the chair beside her. When he complied, she took his hand in hers, her fingers cool and fragile. "You like her?" Mason blinked, caught off guard. "Nayeli, she's remarkable, given her circumstances." Eleanor smiled knowingly. "More than remarkable, I think." Her expression grew serious. "Mason, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have shared long ago." "What is it?" Eleanor's cloudy eyes seemed to look beyond him, into the past. "When I was younger, before I met your father, I was lost in the mountains during a spring storm. I would have died if not for an Apache woman who found me. She brought me to her camp, cared for me through the fever that followed. I stayed with her people for nearly a season. Mason stared at his mother in disbelief. You lived with the Apache? Why didn't you ever tell me? It was a different time. Such associations weren't spoken of. Eleanor squeezed his hand. The woman who saved me was called Silent Dawn. She taught me their healing ways, their language. We became as sisters. The revelation stunned Mason. It explained so much. His mother's unusual views, her knowledge of native remedies, her immediate acceptance of Nayeli. What happened to her, he asked. This Silent Dawn? A shadow crossed Eleanor's face. When I left to return to my own people, she gave me a gift, a silver necklace with 3 interlocking triangles, the symbol of her family's protection. She coughed, a deep, racking sound that shook her frail body. When she could speak again, she continued, I've kept it all these years, hidden. It's in my trunk, wrapped in red cloth. When I'm gone, I want you to have it. Mother, no, listen, she interrupted with surprising firmness. That necklace is important. More important than I realized until now. Her eyes drifted toward the cot where Nayeli slept. There are no coincidences, Mason. You finding her, bringing her here, it's part of a circle completing itself. Mason frowned, concerned his mother's fever was causing delirium. You should rest. I'll rest soon enough, Eleanor said, a calm acceptance in her voice that chilled him. Promise me you'll look after her. Help her find her way home when she's ready. I promise, Mason said, though he had no idea how he would fulfill such a vow. Eleanor seemed satisfied. She closed her eyes, her breathing easing slightly as she drifted toward sleep. You're a good man, Mason Thorne. Better than you believe yourself to be. Mason sat with her until her breathing steadied, his mind reeling from her revelations. The connection between his mother and the Apache was unexpected, but somehow felt right, like a missing piece of a puzzle he hadn't known was incomplete. He checked on Nayeli one last time before taking up his position by the door, rifle across his lap. The night was silent, the falling snow muffling all sound from the world outside. But Mason remained vigilant, his senses attuned to any approach, any threat to the unlikely family that had formed within these walls. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But for now, in this moment of quiet between one day and the next, there was a strange peace in the cabin, a fragile harmony of 3 souls bound by circumstance and choice, each carrying their burdens, their hopes, and their secrets into the uncertain future that awaited them all. Dawn broke with streaks of pale light filtering through the shuttered windows. Mason woke instantly, years of military training having conditioned him to transition from sleep to full alertness in seconds. He checked his surroundings. Nayeli was still asleep on her cot, her breathing steady and deep. Eleanor remained in her rocking chair where she had insisted on staying, despite Mason's attempts to move her to her bed. The cabin was cold. The fire had died down to embers during the night, casting only faint warmth into the room. Mason moved silently, adding kindling and logs until flames licked upward again. Outside, fresh snow had fallen, blanketing the world in pristine white. The silence was absolute, the kind that came only with heavy snowfall. A muffling of all sound as if the world itself were holding its breath. As Mason prepared coffee, a soft sound from Eleanor caught his attention. Her breathing had changed, becoming more labored, the rattle in her chest more pronounced. He moved to her side, kneeling to check her condition. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open, cloudy and unfocused. Mason? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm here, he said, taking her frail hand in his. The trunk, she managed between shallow breaths. Remember what I told you. Mason nodded, his throat tight. I remember. Eleanor's gaze drifted beyond him, seeing something he couldn't. It's nearly time, she murmured. I can feel it. Don't talk like that, Mason said, gripping her hand tighter. You'll outlast us all. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Always stubborn. Her eyes focused on him with sudden clarity. Promise me, you'll find your way back. Back where? To yourself. Her fingers tightened weakly around his. The man you were before the war made you something else. Before Mason could respond, a movement caught his eye. Nayeli had awakened and pushed herself up on her elbows, watching them with solemn understanding. She met Mason's gaze and nodded slightly, as if confirming what they both knew. Eleanor was slipping away. The morning passed in a strange suspension of time. Mason tended to his mother, spooning broth between her lips when she would take it, adjusting her blankets, applying cool cloths to her fevered brow. Nayeli observed silently from her cot, respecting the private grief unfolding before her, yet somehow lending strength through her steady presence. By midday, Eleanor had drifted into a fitful sleep. Mason helped Nayeli into her chair and prepared a simple meal of cornbread and dried venison. They ate in silence, the only sounds Eleanor's labored breathing and the occasional pop from the fire. She is making her journey, Nayeli said finally. Her spirit prepares to leave. Mason didn't answer, unable to voice the truth he had been avoiding for months. Among my people, Nayeli continued, her tone gentle, when one begins the final journey, we sit with them. We speak of good memories, of brave deeds. We help the spirit remember joy, not pain. Mason looked at her, recognizing the wisdom in her words. What do I say? He asked, his voice rough. What is in your heart? She replied simply. She will hear. That afternoon, as winter light faded early from the sky, Mason sat beside his mother and spoke of things long unmentioned, hunting trips when he was a boy, the garden she had lovingly tended before her illness, the songs she used to sing while working. He spoke until his voice grew hoarse, until the memories flowed like water breaking through a dam. Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes smiling faintly at a particular memory, sometimes too deep in her own journey to respond. Nayeli watched from her chair, occasionally offering a word or an observation that prompted Mason to recall another story, another moment worth preserving. As darkness fell, Eleanor's breathing changed again, becoming more shallow, more strained. Mason lit the lamps and built up the fire, as if the light and warmth could somehow tether her to this world a little longer. Mason, Eleanor called suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been all day. The trunk, now! He hesitated, reluctant to leave her side. Go, Nayeli urged. I will watch her. Mason moved to the cedar trunk, opening it to search among his mother's few possessions. At the bottom, wrapped in red cloth as she had described, he found a silver necklace, 3 interlocking triangles on a delicate chain. The craftsmanship was exquisite, unlike anything he'd seen before. The silver had been polished by years of handling, suggesting Eleanor had worn it often, though secretly. He returned to his mother's side, the necklace cradled in his palm. I found it, he said, showing her. Eleanor's eyes brightened at the sight. Good, she whispered. It must return where it belongs. Her gaze shifted to Nayeli, and something passed between the two women, an understanding Mason couldn't fully grasp. Then Eleanor reached for his hand, pressing the necklace into his palm and curling his fingers around it. Keep it safe, she instructed, until the time comes. Mason nodded, tucking the necklace into his shirt pocket. I will. Eleanor's face relaxed, as if a final task had been completed. Her breathing eased slightly, though the rattle remained. She looked up at her son with eyes suddenly clear and focused. I love you, my boy, she said distinctly. Always have, always will. I love you too, Mother, Mason replied, his voice breaking. Eleanor smiled, then closed her eyes. Her breathing continued, but shallower now, her body conserving what little strength remained for these final hours. The night deepened. Mason sat vigil beside his mother, while Nayeli dozed in her chair, waking occasionally to check on them both. Shortly after midnight, when the cabin was silent save for the crackling of the fire, Eleanor drew one last shuddering breath. Then stillness. Mason sat motionless, his hand still holding hers. The moment he had dreaded for so long had arrived with a quiet finality that seemed impossible to comprehend. His mother was gone, her spirit departed, leaving only the fragile shell that had housed her fierce and loving soul. She is free now, Nayeli said softly. No more pain. Mason nodded, unable to speak. He gently closed his mother's eyes and arranged her hands across her chest, the simple dignity of the gesture a final act of love. The remainder of the night passed in a blur. Mason wrapped his mother's body in clean sheets, his movements mechanical, driven by necessity rather than conscious thought. Nayeli kept watch, her presence a silent support. Morning brought clearing skies but bitter cold. The ground would be frozen solid, making burial nearly impossible. Yet it couldn't wait. Mason knew what needed to be done. He dressed in his warmest clothes and stepped outside to face the grim task ahead. The cold air burned his lungs, the kind of deep cold that settled into bones and never fully left. He chose a spot beneath the old oak tree where Eleanor had liked to sit in summer, watching the valley spread out before her. The ground was hard as iron, resisting each strike of the shovel. For hours he worked, sweat freezing on his brow, muscles screaming in protest. The physical pain was almost welcome, a distraction from the hollow ache in his chest. The grave needed to be deep. Wolves and coyotes would dig if given the chance. So he continued, one shovelful after another, the rhythm becoming a meditation of sorts. When he returned to the cabin to warm himself briefly, he found Nayeli had managed to pull herself to the window. She was watching him, her dark eyes solemn but without pity. She understood this was his burden to bear, his duty to fulfill, and respected him enough not to offer empty comfort. "There is coffee," she said simply. Mason nodded gratefully, pouring a cup with hands raw from labor. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, the hot drink reviving his frozen limbs. "Your mother was a remarkable woman," Nayeli said finally. "To have lived among my people, to have learned our ways. It explains much." Mason studied her over the rim of his cup. "You recognize the necklace?" Nayeli nodded. "It bears the mark of the Red Sun family. My family. Only those under our protection would carry such a symbol." Her eyes met his directly. "The woman your mother spoke of, Silent Dawn, was my mother." The revelation struck Mason like a physical blow. "Your mother?" "Yes, she died when I was young, but I remember the stories, how she once saved a white woman lost in the mountains, how they became as sisters." Nayeli's expression softened with memory. "My mother said the white woman had hair like fire and a spirit just as bright." Mason couldn't help a small smile. "That sounds like my mother." "The circle completes itself," Nayeli said, echoing Eleanor's words from the night before. "You saved the daughter of the woman who saved your mother." The connection was too profound to be coincidence, too meaningful to be dismissed as chance. Mason felt something shift inside him, as if pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving suddenly fell into place. "I should finish," he said after a moment, setting down his empty cup. "The day grows short." Nayeli nodded. "I will prepare her for the journey." While Mason returned to his grim labor outside, Nayeli worked within the limits of her mobility to prepare Eleanor's body according to Apache tradition. She combed the old woman's silver hair, braiding it with strands of her own hair, a symbol of connection between the living and the departed. She sang softly, ancient songs meant to guide the spirit homeward. By mid-afternoon, the grave was deep enough. Mason returned to the cabin, his body exhausted but his mind clear. Together, he and Nayeli completed the preparations, wrapping Eleanor's body in her favorite quilt, tucking small tokens beside her. A carved wooden bird Mason had made as a boy, dried flowers from her garden, the worn Bible she had read each night. The actual burial was brief, conducted in the waning light of the winter day. Mason carried his mother to her final resting place, laid her gently in the earth, and spoke a few words, not from any formal prayer, but from his heart. Nayeli added her own blessing in Apache, her clear voice carrying across the silent valley. As Mason filled the grave, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. He worked by lantern light to finish, placing a rough wooden cross at the head. There would be time for a proper marker when spring came, when the ground softened enough to work stone. When he finally returned to the cabin, cold and exhausted beyond words, Nayeli had managed to prepare a simple meal. She had moved herself back to the cot, leaving Mason's mother's rocking chair painfully empty beside the fire. "Eat," she instructed, "then rest. Your body needs strength." Mason did as told, too drained to argue. The food was basic, cornbread and beans, but hot and filling. As he ate, the realization settled over him that he and Nayeli were now alone in the cabin, dependent on each other in ways neither had anticipated. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice rough with fatigue. Nayeli considered the question. "We survive," she said simply. "One day follows another. We honor your mother by continuing." The pragmatic wisdom of her words resonated with Mason's own nature. There would be time for deeper grief later. For now, survival demanded focus, demanded movement forward. That night, Mason slept in his usual place near the door, rifle across his lap. But exhaustion soon overcame vigilance, pulling him into a dreamless sleep deeper than any he'd known in years. He woke to the sound of movement. Opening his eyes cautiously, he saw Nayeli pulling herself along the edge of her cot, working to reach the water bucket on the floor. Her face was set with determination, her arms trembling slightly with the effort. Mason started to rise, intending to help, but something in her expression stopped him. This was important to her, this small act of independence, this refusal to be helpless. So he remained still, watching as she finally reached the dipper, satisfied herself with a drink, and worked her way back to her original position. Only then did he stir, making enough noise to announce his waking. Nayeli glanced at him, a knowing look in her eyes that told him she had been aware of his observation all along. "Morning," he said, moving to stoke the fire. "Your mother's spirit is at peace," Nayeli said without preamble. "I dreamed of her in the night. She was walking toward mountains, without pain." Mason paused, the simple image bringing unexpected comfort. "Thank you for telling me." They settled into a routine over the next few days, adjusting to Eleanor's absence. Mason continued helping Nayeli with her exercises, supporting her as she stood for increasingly longer periods. He noticed small improvements, a twitch in her thigh muscle, a moment of sensation reported in her right foot. The changes were minimal, but they fed a cautious hope. Nayeli, for her part, contributed where she could. Her hands were skilled with needle and thread, mending clothes and even fashioning a more practical dress for herself from one of Eleanor's old garments. She proved to be a knowledgeable healer as well, directing Mason to gather specific plants from his dried stores to brew teas for various ailments. 4 days after Eleanor's burial, Mason spotted tracks in the fresh snow while checking his trap lines. Boot prints, at least 3 men, moving cautiously along the edge of the property. They hadn't approached the cabin directly, but the pattern of movement suggested reconnaissance, studying the layout, planning an approach. When he returned, he found Nayeli practicing with the Colt, dry firing it at targets she had established around the room. Her aim was improving, her hands steady and sure. "They're coming," Mason said without preamble, hanging his coat by the door. Nayeli nodded, unsurprised. "How many?" "3, maybe 4. Blackwell's men, I'd guess." "When?" "Soon. They're watching, learning the routine." Mason checked his rifle, then began moving supplies to more strategic locations around the cabin. "We should prepare." For the next 2 days, they lived in a state of heightened alertness. Mason reinforced the shutters, stockpiled water, and positioned weapons for easy access. Nayeli insisted on taking regular shifts watching the approaches to the cabin, her warrior training evident in the methodical way she scanned the terrain. The attack, when it came, was at dawn, the traditional time for such things, when sleep was deepest and reaction slowest. But Mason and Nayeli were already awake, having anticipated the timing. The first warning was a subtle change in the quality of light outside, a flicker of movement where no movement should be. Then came the sound of snow crunching under boots, trying to be silent but betrayed by the crisp winter crust. Mason positioned himself at the window, rifle ready. Nayeli had the Colt, seated in her chair with a clear line of sight to the door. 4 men, Mason whispered, counting the shadows moving through the trees, spread out, approaching from different angles. Nayeli nodded, her face composed, showing none of the fear a lesser person might feel. She was a warrior in her element, despite her disability. The first shot came without warning, a rifle crack that sent splinters flying from the doorframe. Mason returned fire, aiming not to kill, but to drive them back, to establish that the cabin was defended. "They're trying to surround us," he said, moving to another window to check the rear approaches. Another shot, this one through the window, narrowly missing Nayeli. She didn't flinch, simply adjusted her position and waited, conserving ammunition until she had a clear target. The exchange of fire continued for several minutes, neither side gaining advantage. Mason recognized the tactics. They were testing the defenses, looking for weakness. Soon they would make a coordinated rush, hoping to overwhelm through numbers. "Get ready," he warned Nayeli. "They'll come at once, from multiple sides." She nodded, her eyes never leaving her assigned sector. The rush came as predicted, two men charging the front door while others provided covering fire. Mason shot one in the leg, dropping him screaming into the snow. Nayeli fired twice, her aim true despite her lack of experience. A cry of pain suggested she'd hit her target as well. The attackers fell back, dragging their wounded behind cover. For a moment, silence descended, broken only by harsh breathing and the moans of the injured man outside. "Thorn," a voice called from the trees. "This doesn't have to get worse. Just send out the Apache woman and we'll leave you be." Mason recognized the voice, one of Blackwell's men, though not Blackwell himself. "She's not property to be handed over," he shouted back. "Ride away while you still can." A bitter laugh answered him. "You're outnumbered, Thorn. We've got more men coming. You can't hold out forever." It was likely a bluff, but Mason couldn't be certain. If Blackwell had indeed sent reinforcements, the situation could deteriorate rapidly. "What do we do?" Nayeli asked, her voice steady despite the danger. Mason considered their options. "We have supplies for a week, ammunition for longer. If they lay siege, we wait them out. Montana winter's no place for men to camp without proper shelter." Nayeli nodded, accepting his assessment. "And if they rush again?" "We defend," he said simply. "I won't let them take you." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, an understanding deeper than words could express. They were bound now, not just by circumstance, but by choice, by the willingness to risk everything for each other. The standoff continued through the morning, occasional shots exchanged, but no further rush attempted. The wounded man outside had gone quiet, either unconscious or dead from blood loss and exposure. Mason kept watch, moving between windows, conserving ammunition. Around midday, a movement at the edge of the forest caught his attention, not coming from the direction of the attackers, but from the east, where the valley narrowed into foothills. A group of riders, moving silently through the trees, their approach hidden from Blackwell's men by the terrain. Mason's heart sank. If these were the promised reinforcements, the situation had just become dire. But something about their movement gave him pause. These riders moved differently, fluid, almost part of the landscape, with a discipline that spoke of years of experience in wilderness warfare. "Nayeli," he called softly, "look to the east ridge." She maneuvered herself to see, her breath catching at the sight. "Apache," she whispered, hope and disbelief mingling in her voice. "Red Sun warriors." The newcomers were indeed Apache, at least a dozen strong, moving with the confidence of predators on familiar hunting grounds. They had clearly assessed the situation and were positioning to encircle Blackwell's men, who remained oblivious to the new threat. "How?" Mason wondered aloud. "How did they find us?" "My father never stopped searching," Nayeli said, a tremor of emotion in her voice. "He would have sent scouts, hunters, to track any sign of me." The tactical situation had changed completely. Blackwell's men were now the ones surrounded, caught between Mason's defended cabin and a war party of skilled Apache warriors. The attack came with devastating swiftness. The Apache struck from multiple directions simultaneously, their war cries shattering the winter stillness. Blackwell's men, caught by surprise, barely had time to turn before arrows found their marks. Two fell immediately. A third managed to fire once before an arrow took him through the chest. The fourth man, the leader who had called to Mason earlier, fled toward the cabin, perhaps hoping for mercy from the lesser of two enemies. He never made it. An arrow caught him between the shoulder blades, driving him face first into the snow. Within moments, it was over. The Apache moved among the fallen, confirming kills with practiced efficiency. Then, as one, they turned their attention to the cabin. "I need to go out," Nayeli said urgently. "They will kill you if they find you with me." "They might kill me anyway," Mason replied grimly, but he understood the necessity. He helped her into her warmest clothes, then lifted her into his arms. "Ready?" She nodded, steeling herself for what was to come. Mason kicked the door open and stepped out slowly, Nayeli cradled in his arms. The Apache warriors formed a semicircle before the cabin, arrows nocked and aimed directly at him. Their faces were painted for war, expressions impassive beneath the markings. Nayeli called out in Apache, her voice strong and clear. Mason understood enough to recognize her identifying herself, explaining that she had been captured and then rescued by the man holding her. The warriors did not lower their weapons. One stepped forward, taller than the others, with a band of red paint across his eyes and intricate tattoos visible on his bare arms despite the cold. He spoke sharply, his tone demanding. He asked if you have touched me, Nayeli translated, her voice low. If you have claimed me as men do. Mason shook his head. Tell him no. Tell him I found you abandoned and brought you here for healing only. Nayeli relayed his words. The warrior's eyes narrowed, studying Mason with predatory intensity. He spoke again, gesturing at the cabin. He asked why you helped me, Nayeli translated. Why a white soldier would save an Apache woman. Mason considered his answer carefully, aware that his life hung by a thread. He decided on the truth. Tell him because it was right, because no person should be treated as property, and because my mother once received the same kindness from an Apache woman named Silent Dawn. As Nayeli translated, a visible change came over the warrior. His posture shifted, his eyes widening slightly at the mention of Silent Dawn. He approached, stopping just beyond arm's reach, and spoke directly to Nayeli in rapid Apache too complex for Mason to follow. Their conversation continued for several tense minutes, Nayeli's voice becoming more animated, occasionally gesturing toward Mason or the fresh grave beneath the oak tree. Finally, the warrior nodded and stepped back. This is Tall Eagle, Nayeli said to Mason. My brother, the war chief of Red Sun. Mason's grip tightened instinctively around her, a protective gesture he immediately regretted as Tall Eagle's eyes tracked the movement. But the warrior's next action surprised him. Tall Eagle reached slowly to his neck and removed a leather thong bearing a small stone amulet. He held it out toward Mason. He offers you protection, Nayeli explained, wonder in her voice. It is a rare honor. Mason shifted Nayeli's weight to free one hand and accepted the token, inclining his head in respect. Thank him for my safety. After Nayeli translated, Tall Eagle gave a curt nod, then issued orders to his warriors. Two approached to take Nayeli from Mason's arms. He hesitated, reluctant to release her to these stern-faced men, but Nayeli touched his cheek gently. It's all right, she said. They will not harm me. I am daughter of the chief. This was the first confirmation of what Mason had suspected, that Nayeli's status among her people was far higher than she had revealed. He carefully transferred her to the waiting warriors, who handled her with surprising gentleness. Tall Eagle spoke again, and Nayeli translated. He says they will take me home, to our winter camp. My father has grieved me as dead. He will rejoice. Mason nodded, a strange emptiness spreading in his chest at the thought of Nayeli leaving. It was the right outcome, the one he had hoped for in abstract terms, yet the reality of it left him hollow. Will you, he began, then stopped, unsure what he was asking. Nayeli understood nonetheless. I will not forget, she said softly. What you did, what we shared. Tall Eagle interrupted with another command. The warriors began to withdraw, carrying Nayeli toward the trees where horses waited. She looked back once, her dark eyes meeting Mason's across the growing distance. Then she was gone, vanished into the forest with her kinsman. Mason stood alone in the snow, the warrior's amulet cold in his palm, watching the place where Nayeli had disappeared. The Red Sun Apache moved like ghosts through the winter landscape, leaving no trace of their passing, save the bodies of Blackwell's men sprawled in the bloodied snow. The silence that followed was absolute, a void that seemed to swallow all sound, all feeling. Mason turned slowly back to the cabin, suddenly aware of how empty it would be without either his mother's gentle presence or Nayeli's quiet strength. Inside, evidence of the brief battle remained. Bullet holes in the walls, shell casings on the floor. Nayeli's chair positioned for defense. Mason moved mechanically, banking the fire, checking supplies, his mind struggling to process the whirlwind of events that had transformed his life in mere days. He fingered the amulet Tall Eagle had given him, studying its simple carved surface, a mountain peak with the sun rising behind it. Protection, Nayeli had said, but protection from what? The immediate danger had passed with Blackwell's men dead, and Nayeli returned to her people. As evening approached, Mason found himself standing before his mother's trunk, driven by an impulse he couldn't quite name. He opened it again, searching through the few possessions Eleanor had treasured. Beneath a stack of neatly folded handkerchiefs, he found a small, leather-bound journal he had never seen before. Opening it revealed his mother's familiar handwriting, the pages yellowed with age. It was a diary, beginning some 30 years earlier with her journey west as a young woman. Mason settled by the fire to read, seeking connection with the mother he had lost and the history she had kept hidden. Eleanor's account of her time with the Apache was detailed and moving. She described being found half dead from exposure, nursed back to health by Silent Dawn, and gradually accepted into the tribe's daily life. She wrote of learning their language, their healing practices, their profound spiritual connection to the land. Most surprising were her descriptions of Red Sun himself, Nayeli's father, then a young warrior who had shown kindness to the strange white woman in their midst. Eleanor had respected him deeply, describing him as a man of vision who sees beyond the boundaries others accept as fixed. As Mason read further, he discovered something that made his breath catch. Eleanor had been with the Apache during a raid by white settlers. She had helped Silent Dawn deliver her first child, a daughter named Nayeli. Eleanor had been present at Nayeli's birth, had held her as an infant. The circle completes itself. The phrase echoed in Mason's mind, taking on new layers of meaning with each revelation. The final pages of the journal contained Eleanor's reflections after returning to her own people, her marriage to Mason's father, and her growing disillusionment with the treatment of native tribes by the expanding American nation. She had kept her connection to the Apache's secret out of necessity, but had never forgotten the debt she owed to Silent Dawn and her people. The last entry, dated just weeks before her death, read simply, "The necklace must return to its rightful place. Perhaps then the circle will be complete." Mason closed the journal, emotions churning. His mother had known so much more than she had ever shared with him. She had kept these secrets, these connections, waiting for the right moment to reveal them. And somehow, through fate or providence, Nayeli had come into their lives just in time for Eleanor to fulfill her final obligation. Except the necklace hadn't returned with Nayeli. It remained in Mason's pocket, forgotten in the chaos of the Apache arrival. He drew it out now, the silver gleaming in the firelight. The three interlocking triangles, the symbol of Red Sun family protection, seemed to pulse with significance. This then was his purpose now. To ensure the necklace returned to its rightful place, to complete the circle his mother had begun so long ago. Mason spent a restless night, the empty cabin amplifying every creak and settling sound. By morning, his decision was made. He would follow the Apache trail, find their winter camp, and return the necklace as his mother had intended. It was a dangerous proposition. Red Sun territory was forbidden to white men, and even with Tall Eagle's token of protection, he risked death simply by entering their lands. But the alternative, remaining alone in this cabin, haunted by fresh absence, was somehow worse. He spent the day preparing, packing supplies, studying his maps of the region. The Apache winter camp would likely be in the southern valleys where natural hot springs kept the ground from freezing, and game remained accessible. It would be a journey of several days, longer in the deep snow. As dusk approached, a sound outside drew his attention, hoofbeats, approaching slowly up the trail. Mason grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, expecting perhaps more of Blackwell's men seeking revenge. Instead, he saw Sheriff Locke dismounting before the cabin, his badge catching the last light of day. Mason opened the door cautiously, rifle still ready. "Locke," he acknowledged, "surprised to see you." The sheriff's weathered face was grave as he took in the bullet holes in the cabin walls and the dark stains in the snow where bodies had lain. "I can see why," he replied. "Looks like I missed quite a party." "You could say that," Locke gestured at the bloodstains. "Blackwell's men?" Mason nodded. "4 of them came for the Apache woman. And where is she now?" "Gone. Her people came for her arm." Locke exhaled slowly, processing this information. "Red Sun Apache, in this valley." He shook his head. "This complicates things, Mason." "How so?" "Blackwell's dead." The statement fell between them like a stone. "Found yesterday at his ranch. Arrow through his heart, Red Sun style." Mason's expression remained neutral, though his mind raced with implications. "Sounds like someone settled the score." "More than one score, from what I hear. Blackwell's operation was bigger than most knew. He'd been raiding Apache camps, taking women, selling them downriver. Locke's disgust was evident. The territorial governor's in a bind now. Can't publicly condemn Blackwell without admitting he turned a blind eye to slave trading. Can't ignore the Apache retaliation without appearing weak. And where do I fit in this political mess? Mason asked. Though he suspected the answer, Locke met his gaze directly. They need a scapegoat, Mason, someone to blame for inciting the Apache. Your name came up, given your history with the war and your recent guest. Convenient. Isn't it just? Locke's tone was dry. I rode out to warn you. There's a military detachment coming tomorrow. Captain named Hollister. Says he has orders to question you about collaboration with hostile natives. Mason's jaw tightened. Collaboration was a loaded term, one that could lead to a hangman's noose with the right or wrong military tribunal. I appreciate the warning, he said. When exactly should I expect this, Captain Hollister? Tomorrow afternoon, most likely. They're moving slow in the snow. Locke hesitated, then added, if someone were to not be here when they arrived, well, this valley's a big place, easy for a man to disappear for a while if he had reason. The suggestion was clear. Locke was offering him a chance to flee, to avoid what would almost certainly be a rigged proceeding. My mother's buried here, Mason said, nodding toward the oak tree. I can't just leave. Your mother would want you alive, Locke countered, and some fights can't be won head-on, Mason. But you taught me that in the war. The reminder of their shared past struck home. Mason had indeed preached strategic withdrawal when necessary, living to fight another day. What about you, he asked, and won't they know you came to warn me? Locke shrugged. I'll say I came to investigate reports of gunfire. Found signs of a fight, but no bodies, no you. Simple enough. Mason studied the sheriff, seeing the decency beneath the badge, the man trying to do right in a corrupt system. Why help me, Samuel? After everything? Because what happened at Gettysburg wasn't your fault, Locke said firmly. That family died because someone gave you bad intelligence, because someone wanted those deserters found at any cost. You were a weapon being used, not the hand directing it. He paused. And because I've seen enough good men destroyed by politics to last a lifetime. The words penetrated Mason's armor of guilt and regret, touching a truth he had long avoided. He had carried the weight of those innocent deaths for years, but perhaps Locke was right. Perhaps the true responsibility lay elsewhere. Thank you, he said simply. Locke nodded, then glanced at the darkening sky. I should head back, less chance of being seen leaving here after dark. Be careful, Mason warned. If Red Sun warriors are still in the area, I'll keep my eyes open. Locke mounted his horse, then paused. Whatever you decide, Mason, good luck. Mason watched him ride away, disappearing into the gathering twilight. Then he returned to the cabin, his decision crystallizing with each step. He would leave before dawn, taking only what he could carry. Not to flee indefinitely, but to complete Eleanor's final wish. To return the silver necklace to Red Sun's people. To close the circle that had begun 30 years ago. If he survived that journey, he would face whatever came next. If not, well, there were worse ways to die than in pursuit of a worthy purpose. That night, Mason prepared with methodical thoroughness, packing only essentials: food, weapons, medical supplies, warm clothing. He secured his mother's journal inside his coat, close to his heart. The silver necklace he wrapped carefully and placed in a small leather pouch around his neck. As the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Mason stood before his mother's grave, saying a silent farewell. Then he turned toward the south, toward the unknown territory where Nayeli and her people awaited, unaware of his coming. The journey ahead would test every skill he had learned as a tracker, every lesson survival had taught him. But for the first time in years, Mason Thorne walked with purpose beyond mere existence. Whether that purpose led to redemption or destruction remained to be seen, but the path itself was clear. He moved into the forest, following the nearly invisible trail left by the Apache warriors. Within moments, the trees had swallowed him, leaving only his footprints in the snow to mark his passing. And even those would soon be covered by the fresh flakes beginning to fall from the heavy gray sky above. 30 miles north of the Apache winter camp, Captain James Hollister stood at the entrance of his command tent, surveying the military encampment taking shape around him. 2 companies of cavalry, 1 of infantry, and soon artillery, all under his command. Steam rose from the nostrils of tethered horses as soldiers hammered tent stakes into the frozen ground and established defensive positions. "Sir, the scouts have returned," announced Lieutenant Wilson, a young officer eager to impress. "No sign of the Apache winter camp yet, but they found tracks heading south." Hollister nodded, his cold blue eyes narrowing slightly. At 42, he'd spent over half his life in uniform and bore the weathered features of a man who'd seen his share of frontier violence. 3 campaigns against hostile tribes had earned him a reputation for ruthless efficiency and an almost pathological need for victory. "And what of Thorne?" Hollister asked, his voice betraying particular interest in this quarry. "Any sign of our deserter?" "Nothing concrete, sir, but there are rumors from settlers that he headed south after burying his mother. Some say he had an Apache woman with him." Hollister's mouth tightened into a thin line. Mason Thorne, the great hunter of deserters, now a deserter himself. There was something personal in his tone, an old grievance perhaps. Ironic, isn't it? "Yes, sir." Wilson wasn't sure what else to say. "Post extra sentries tonight," Hollister ordered. "Double the pickets. These savages are watching us, make no mistake. And if they have Thorne with them—" He paused, looking out at the snow-covered mountains. "Well, that makes our job both harder and more interesting." As the lieutenant hurried to comply, Hollister unfolded a map on the field table, his finger tracing the likely locations for Apache camps. His career advancement hinged on this campaign. A decisive victory before the official spring campaign season would guarantee his promotion to colonel. Failure would relegate him to frontier postings until retirement. The Apache were merely obstacles. But Thorne was unfinished business. Mason Thorne moved like a ghost through the pre-dawn darkness, his body painted in the Apache manner, his movements silent despite the snow underfoot. Beside him, Tall Eagle signaled a halt as they reached the ridge overlooking the army encampment. 3 other warriors, Gray Wolf, Running Elk, and Stonehand, spread out in practice formation, each taking position to observe a different section of the camp. 4 days had passed since they'd left the winter settlement, traveling south with single-minded purpose. Mason had expected resistance from Tall Eagle, perhaps even hostility, but the Apache war chief had been surprisingly receptive to his counsel. Not friendly, but respectful, a warrior acknowledging another warrior's skills. "They have more men than the scouts reported," Tall Eagle whispered, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "At least 200. Mason studied the camp layout through narrowed eyes. "Hollister is being cautious. Look at the picket placement. Too close together. He's expecting trouble." "He will find it," Tall Eagle replied, a grim smile touching his lips. "But not where he expects." Their plan was simple but effective. While the main body of the tribe headed north as a deliberate decoy, creating tracks and signs of a mass migration, Tall Eagle's small band would strike at the Army's vulnerabilities: supply wagons, horse corrals, communication lines. Not to kill, as Mason had insisted, but to demoralize, to exhaust, to make the campaign so costly that even an ambitious officer like Hollister would be forced to reconsider. "Remember," Mason said quietly as the warriors prepared for their first action, "we take what we need and damage what we can't take, but we avoid bloodshed where possible." Tall Eagle gave him a long look. "You still protect them, these men who hunt your people and mine." "I protect what remains of the man I used to be," Mason answered honestly, "and I keep my word to your father." Something like understanding passed between them. Then Tall Eagle turned to his warriors and gave instructions in rapid Apache. The 5 men split into 3 groups, each with a different target. Mason would accompany Gray Wolf to the supply wagons on the eastern edge of camp. Their goal? Medicines, ammunition, and whatever food could be carried. As he moved through the shadows toward his objective, Mason felt strangely calm. 4 months ago, he had been a solitary figure in an isolated cabin, trapped by guilt and grief. Now he was something else, neither fully Apache nor white man, but a bridge between worlds, fighting not for glory or redemption, but for survival. The stone eagle that Naeli had given him rested against his chest, a talisman of purpose and promise. Each step took him further from his old life, deeper into a future he could not clearly see, but somehow knew was right. The first light of dawn was still hours away when Mason and Grey Wolf reached the supply wagons. Voices surrounded him, men, women, children, speaking rapidly in Apache. Mason caught fragments of conversation, enough to know his arrival was causing considerable stir. He was guided to a seated position on what felt like a fur or hide, the blindfold still in place. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then a new voice spoke, closer, carrying the unmistakable tone of authority. "Remove it." The command was given in perfect English. Mason blinked as the blindfold was pulled away, his eyes adjusting painfully to the sudden light. He found himself in a large lodge, a central fire casting warm light on the faces of those gathered around him. Directly before him sat an older man whose bearing alone would have identified him as a leader even without the elaborate ceremonial attire he wore. This could only be Red's son, chief of the tribe and Nayeli's father. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same proud cheekbones, the same penetrating gaze. But where Nayeli's eyes had eventually shown warmth, Red's sons remained coldly evaluative, measuring Mason with the dispassionate assessment of a man deciding whether a wolf should be killed or merely driven away from the camp. "You are far from your own territory, white man," Red's son said, his English deliberate but fluent. "Explain your presence before I decide whether your scalp joins those of the others who trespassed on our lands." Mason's gaze flickered to the dried scalps hanging from a nearby post, most with light-colored hair. The message couldn't be clearer. Yet fear wouldn't serve him now. He met the chief's gaze directly. "I come to return something that belongs to your family," Mason said, his voice steady. "Something entrusted to my mother many years ago by a woman named Silent Dawn." A murmur ran through the gathered Apache. Red's son's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes at the mention of Silent Dawn's name. "My scouts found no such item among your possessions," he said. "Because I carry it here." Mason nodded toward his chest. "Against my skin. May I show you?" After a tense moment, Red's son nodded. One of the warriors loosened Mason's bonds enough for him to reach inside his shirt and withdraw the small leather pouch. With deliberate movements, he opened it and removed Eleanor's silver necklace, the three interlocking triangles catching the firelight. The effect was immediate. Red's son rose to his feet, his composure finally broken. He stared at the necklace as if seeing a ghost, his hand halfway extended before he caught himself. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, his voice hoarse with suppressed emotion. "My mother was Eleanor Thorne," Mason explained. 30 years ago, she was lost in the mountains during a storm. Silent Dawn found her, brought her to your camp, saved her life. They became as sisters. When my mother left to return to her people, Silent Dawn gave her this necklace as protection. My mother kept it safe all these years." Mason held the necklace out, offering it to Red's son. "Before she died, she asked me to return it to where it belongs. I believe that place is here, with you." Red's son made no move to take the necklace. Instead, he studied Mason's face intently, searching for deception. "You are the one who found my daughter," he said finally, "the one who sheltered her when she was injured." "Yes." "Oui, man." The simple question carried the weight of decades of betrayal and violence between their peoples. Mason considered and discarded several answers before settling on the truth. "Because it was right," he said. "Because she deserved to be treated as a human being, not as property." Red Son's gaze didn't waver. "Many white men speak of what is right. Few act accordingly. I'm not many men." "No," Red Son agreed, surprising Mason. "My daughter says you are not. She says you cared for her with honor, that you defended her against your own kind." His eyes narrowed. "She says your mother knew our ways, our healing." "I only learned of this recently," Mason admitted. "My mother kept many secrets." Red Son finally reached out and took the necklace, his fingers closing around it with visible emotion. "This belonged to my wife," he said quietly. "It was passed through her family for generations, a symbol of our lineage. I thought it lost forever when she died." He looked at the necklace for a long moment, then back to Mason. "You have traveled dangerous ground to return this. Why risk death to bring back a trinket?" "It was my mother's final wish," Mason said. "And," he hesitated, then continued, "I needed to know Nayeli was safe, that she had reached her people without harm." Something shifted in Red Son's expression, a recognition, perhaps, or a reassessment. He motioned to the warriors, who cut Mason's bonds completely. "Come," the chief said. "There is someone who wishes to see you." Mason was led through the camp, aware of the stares of the Apache as he passed. The settlement was larger than he had expected, at least 30 lodges arranged in a protective circle around a central gathering place. The location was well chosen, a natural bowl in the landscape, sheltered from wind, with hot springs nearby that kept the ground from freezing even in the depths of winter. They approached a lodge set slightly apart from the others. Red Sun paused outside, calling out a greeting in Apache. A woman's voice answered, and Mason's heart jumped at the familiar tone. Red's son pushed aside the entrance flap and gestured for Mason to enter. Inside, the lodge was warm and well appointed with furs, woven mats, and various implements of daily life. Seated by the central fire, working a piece of leather with practiced hands, was Nayeli. She looked up as Mason entered, her dark eyes widening in surprise and then, unmistakably, pleasure. She was dressed in traditional Apache clothing now, her hair braided elaborately with beads and small silver ornaments. She appeared healthier than when he had last seen her face fuller, her color better. "Mason," she said, setting aside her work, "what are you doing here?" Before he could answer, Red Sun spoke from behind him. "He brought this." He held out the silver necklace. Nayeli gasped softly. "Mother's necklace," she whispered. "How?" "Your white woman, Eleanor, kept it safe," Red Sun explained. "Her son has returned it to us." Nayeli's eyes met Mason's, filled with questions. Red Sun watched them both for a moment, then withdrew from the lodge, leaving them alone. "You shouldn't have come," Nayeli said, though her tone belied her words. "It's dangerous for any white man in our territory, especially now." "I had to," Mason replied simply. "Your father almost had me killed anyway, so perhaps you're right." A smile touched her lips. "Yet here you stand." She gestured for him to sit across from her. "My father is a good judge of character. He would have sensed if your intentions were false." Mason settled onto the fur-covered ground, studying her openly now. "You look well," he observed. "Stronger." "I am. The healers here have knowledge passed down through generations. They've been working with me daily." She shifted, and to his astonishment, her legs moved slightly in response. "I can feel more now. Not everything, not enough to walk unaided, but more." "That's wonderful news," Mason said sincerely. Nayeli nodded, then fixed him with a penetrating stare. "Now tell me the real reason you came." "The necklace was important, yes, but you could have given it to my brother when he came for me." Mason hesitated. The real reason, he wasn't entirely sure he understood it himself. "I needed to see this through," he said finally, "to complete what my mother started. And," he paused, searching for words, "the cabin was too empty after you both were gone." Understanding softened her features. "You were alone." "Yes. And now?" The question held layers of meaning Mason wasn't prepared to navigate. "Now I've fulfilled my promise," he said carefully. "The necklace is returned. I should go back." "Back to what?" Nayeli challenged gently. "The empty cabin? The memories?" Mason had no answer. The future beyond this moment had seemed unimportant compared to the journey itself. Now, faced with the reality of what waited or didn't wait for him at home, he felt adrift. "There is something else you should know," Nayeli said, her expression growing serious. "The army is looking for you. They've been questioning settlers about a white man who collaborates with hostiles." Mason wasn't surprised. Sheriff Locke had warned him this would happen. "Blackwell's death," he surmised. "They need someone to blame." "Yes, they have offered rewards for information on your whereabouts." Nayeli's eyes held his. "If you return now, they will arrest you. Perhaps worse." The situation was grimmer than Mason had anticipated. Not just questioning, but active pursuit. A price on his head. "How do you know this?" "We have scouts who watch the settlements," Nayeli explained, "and some of the traders who move between worlds bring us news. The military commander, Hollister, is determined to make an example of you." Captain Hollister, the same name Locke had mentioned. This was no coincidence. "So I'm a wanted man now," Mason said grimly. "Ironic, I once hunted deserters. Now I've become one." "You've become someone who stood against injustice," Nayeli corrected. "Someone who chose what was right over what was easy." She hesitated, then added, My father wishes to speak with you again, tonight at the council fire. Mason raised an eyebrow. Should I be concerned? No. A smile touched her lips. If he wanted you dead, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The remainder of the day passed in a surreal blur for Mason. He was given freedom to move about the camp, though always under the watchful eyes of warriors who made no effort to hide their suspicion. Some of the women and children openly stared at him. A white man walking freely among them was clearly unprecedented. Nayeli remained in her lodge, explaining that the day's exertions with the healers left her fatigued. Mason found himself missing her presence more than he cared to admit. Without her as intermediary, he felt acutely his status as outsider, tolerated only through the inexplicable grace of the chief. As dusk approached, the camp's activity shifted. A large fire was built in the central clearing, around which the tribe began to gather. Mason watched from a respectful distance until one of Red Sun's warriors approached and gestured for him to follow. He was led to a place near the fire, not in the inner circle reserved for tribal leaders, but not relegated to the outer fringes either. A position of observation, neither fully accepted nor completely excluded. Across the fire, Nayeli sat beside her father, her posture regal, despite her disability. She caught Mason's eye briefly and gave an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. The council began with ritual, prayers in Apache, the passing of a ceremonial pipe, the recounting of tribal history. Mason understood little of it, but recognized the importance of tradition to this people, whose way of life teetered constantly on the edge of extinction. Finally, Red Sun rose to speak. To Mason's surprise, he addressed the gathering in English. "I speak in the white man's tongue," he announced, "so that our guest may understand. This is a courtesy not often granted to those outside our tribe." His gaze found Mason across the flames. "But these are unusual times calling for unusual measures." A murmur of agreement, or perhaps dissent, rippled through the gathering. "For generations," Redson continued, "we have fought to preserve our ways against those who would take our land, kill our people, and erase our existence. We have made war when necessary, peace when possible. We have endured broken treaties, false promises, and countless betrayals." He paused, his eyes sweeping the assembled faces. "Now we face perhaps our greatest challenge. The white man's army gathers to the north and east, preparing for a spring campaign they believe will finally destroy us." The gravity of his words settled over the gathering like a physical weight. Mason had suspected as much from Locke's warnings, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through him despite the fire's warmth. "Our scouts report many soldiers, many guns," Red Sun stated, "more than we have faced before. They have new weapons, new tactics. They have maps of our territories drawn by trackers who once called themselves our friends." The chief's gaze settled on Mason. "But the white man's greatest strength has always been his numbers, not his understanding. He sees the land as something to possess, not something to belong to. He sees people as either allies or enemies, with nothing between." Red Sun held up the silver necklace, letting it catch the firelight. "Yet here is proof that other possibilities exist." He recounted the story of Eleanor and Silent Dawn, of friendship forged across the boundaries of culture and prejudice. He spoke of Nayeli's captivity and rescue, of Mason's choice to protect her when his own people would have let her die. With each word, Mason felt the tribe's collective attention intensify, measuring him against this unexpected narrative. "I have consulted with the elders," Red Sun announced finally. "I have listened to my daughter's counsel. I have read the signs sent by the spirits." He paused, his decision apparently momentous enough to require dramatic delivery. "Mason Thorne, son of Eleanor, I offer you shelter among us until the snow melts." The pronouncement sent a shockwave through the gathering. Voices rose in Apache, some clearly protesting, others questioning, a few expressing support. Red Sun let the reaction crest and ebb before raising his hand for silence. "This is not a choice made lightly," he said firmly. "This man has shown honor. He has returned what was precious to us, and he possesses knowledge that may help us survive the coming storm." Mason understood the subtext immediately. His military experience, his familiarity with army tactics, his knowledge of how officers like Hollister thought and planned, these made him potentially valuable to a tribe preparing for conflict. It was a pragmatic decision wrapped in the language of honor and reciprocity. What say you, Mason Thorne? Red Sun asked directly. Will you accept our shelter, knowing it comes with obligation to our people? Mason felt the weight of every eye upon him. The question wasn't merely about physical sanctuary, but about where he would place his loyalty in the growing conflict between the world he came from and the people who had shown him unexpected acceptance. His gaze found Nayeli, who watched him with an unreadable expression. Then he looked back to Red Sun. I accept your offer, Mason said, his voice carrying clearly across the fire, and I acknowledge the obligation it brings. His response set off another round of discussion among the Apache, this one more measured. Red Sun nodded solemnly, then made a gesture that apparently concluded the formal council. People began to disperse, some casting curious or suspicious glances at Mason as they passed. Red Sun approached, flanked by Tall Eagle and another warrior Mason hadn't met. You have made a significant choice, the chief said. Not all of my people are pleased. I understand, Mason replied. Trust must be earned. Yes, and you will have that opportunity. Red Sun gestured to the unfamiliar warrior. Grey Wolf will show you where you may sleep. Tomorrow, we will speak more of what your presence here means. As the chief turned away, Nayeli called out to him in Apache. A brief exchange followed, culminating in Red Sun nodding with reluctant permission. Tall Eagle looked less convinced, but followed his father without protest. Nayeli turned to Mason. Help me to my lodge, she requested, though it seemed more for the benefit of those watching than actual need. Two women had already moved to assist her. Mason stepped forward, aware of the scrutinizing eyes of the tribe. He helped Nayeli up, supporting her as she had at the cabin, one arm around her waist, her arm across his shoulders. The familiar connection felt right, a reassurance in this unfamiliar world. They're watching how you treat me, Nayeli murmured as they moved slowly toward her lodge. How you behave with a chief's daughter will tell them much about your character. I thought I was just helping you walk, Mason replied with a hint of dry humor. Nothing is just anything here, she said. Every action carries meaning. Inside her lodge, away from prying eyes, Nayeli relaxed visibly. She allowed Mason to help her to a pile of soft furs that served as her bed, then gestured for him to sit nearby. You surprised me today, she said without preamble. I didn't think you would accept my father's offer. Neither did I, Mason admitted. But returning to my cabin means arrest or worse. And, she prompted when he hesitated. And there's nothing for me there anymore, he finished quietly. Not with both you and my mother gone. Nayeli studied him, her dark eyes reflecting the lodge's fire. You've changed since we met, she observed. There's less shadow in your eyes. Mason hadn't considered this, but realized she was right. The weight of guilt and regret that had been his constant companion since Gettysburg had eased somewhat. Not vanished, but diminished. Perhaps I needed to be reminded that there are still good choices to be made, he said, even in a broken world. And is staying here a good choice? Nayeli asked, her tone serious. You will be asked to help my people prepare for war against your own. Can you do that? It was the question Mason had been asking himself since Red Sun's offer. The answer wasn't simple, yet somehow felt inevitable. The men coming after your tribe, after me, they stopped being my people when they chose cruelty over justice, power over truth. He met her gaze steadily. I won't help kill needlessly, but I will help your people defend themselves, yes. Satisfaction flickered in Nayeli's expression. Good, because my father will ask much of you in the days ahead. She hesitated, then added more softly, as will I. What do you mean? The healers believe I may walk again with proper support, she explained. But I need someone strong enough to hold me as I practice, someone patient enough to work with me for many hours. A challenge entered her eyes. Are you that someone, Mason Thorne? The request touched him unexpectedly deeply. It was a form of trust he hadn't anticipated, an intimacy of a different kind than what they had shared at the cabin. Yes, he said simply, for as long as you need. Something shifted between them in that moment, a deepening of connection, an acknowledgement of possibilities neither was quite ready to name. Nayeli broke the tension with a practical nod. Good, we begin tomorrow at dawn. She reached for a folded blanket nearby. Take this. The nights are cold, even for a white man who thinks himself hardy. Mason accepted the gift with appropriate gravity. "Thank you. Now go," she said, though not unkindly. "Grey Wolf waits to show you your place, and the tribe will talk enough without you spending more time alone in my lodge." Mason nodded, understanding the propriety she was maintaining. He rose to leave, then paused at the entrance. "Nayeli," he said, turning back. "I'm glad I came. Whatever happens." Her expression softened. "So am I, Mason Thorne. So am I." Outside, Grey Wolf waited with stoic patience. He led Mason to a small lodge at the edge of the camp, not isolated enough to be insulting, but positioned where he could be easily observed. The message was clear. Guest, not prisoner, but not fully trusted either. The lodge contained basic provisions: sleeping furs, a small fire pit, a water skin, and some dried meat. Modest, but adequate. Mason thanked Grey Wolf, who acknowledged the courtesy with a curt nod before departing. Alone at last, Mason settled onto the furs, exhaustion from days of travel finally catching up to him. He fingered the amulet Tall Eagle had given him, understanding now its significance, not just protection, but a tangible symbol of connection to this tribe, this family. As sleep began to claim him, Mason reflected on the strange path that had led him here. From war-haunted recluse to adopted ally of the very people he had once been taught to fear. His mother would have appreciated the irony. Eleanor had always seen beyond the artificial boundaries that divided people, had always believed in the possibility of understanding across seemingly unbridgeable divides. Perhaps, in honoring her final wish, he had also discovered her greatest legacy, the courage to choose a different path, to see with new eyes. Tomorrow would bring challenges he could scarcely imagine, obligations that would test his newfound resolve. But for tonight, for this moment, Mason Thorne slept peacefully for the first time in years, no longer the last man in his isolated valley, but a man finding his place in a wider world. The winter days fell into a rhythm unlike anything Mason had known before. Each morning began before dawn with Nayeli's therapy sessions. He would help her through a series of exercises designed by the tribal healers, supporting her weight as she attempted to stand, guiding her tentative steps, massaging the muscles that had begun to respond to stimulation. Progress was painfully slow, but undeniable. By the end of the first week, she could stand with minimal support for nearly a minute. By the end of the second, she had taken 3 steps before her strength gave out. "It's working," she said one morning, her face flushed with triumph after a particularly successful session. "I can feel more every day." Mason nodded, his hands steady at her waist as she balanced. "Your determination is remarkable." "Not determination," she corrected. "Necessity. My people need me whole." The afternoons were dedicated to another form of preparation. Red Sun had indeed asked for Mason's knowledge of military tactics, of the Army's strengths and weaknesses. Each day, they gathered in the chief's lodge, Red Sun, Tall Eagle, and the other war leaders, to discuss strategy, terrain, and the resources available to both sides. Mason found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining how to counter methods he had once employed himself. Yet as the discussions progressed, he realized he was not betraying his country so much as trying to prevent a slaughter on both sides. "The Army will expect you to retreat deeper into the mountains," he explained one afternoon, pointing to a rough map drawn in the dirt floor of the lodge. "They'll send scouts ahead, then follow with the main force. Cavalry first, infantry behind." "We have always used the mountains to our advantage," Tall Eagle countered. "We know paths they do not." "But they have repeating rifles now," Mason pointed out, "and field artillery. Distance won't protect you as it once did." "What would you suggest?" Red Sun asked, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Mason hesitated, then outlined an alternative. Not fighting the Army directly, but making the campaign so costly in resources and morale that the military command would be forced to negotiate. "Hit supply lines, not soldiers when possible," he advised. "Take horses, not lives. Make them fear the land itself, not just the warriors." The strategy discussions often continued into the evening, the Apache leaders debating among themselves in their own language while Mason waited for translations of the conclusions. Not all the warriors trusted his advice, but Red Sun's support ensured they at least considered it. The rest of Mason's time was spent learning the basics of Apache life. Grey Wolf, initially standoffish, gradually assumed the role of cultural guide. He taught Mason rudimentary skills, how to repair weapons in the Apache style, how to move silently through snow, how to read weather patterns particular to these mountains. The lessons were delivered with minimal conversation, but growing respect as Mason proved a capable student. The women of the tribe remained more distant, though their outright suspicion faded as days turned to weeks. Mason was careful to maintain appropriate boundaries, especially regarding Nayeli. Their morning therapy sessions were conducted with deliberate propriety, often with a female elder present as witness. Yet despite these precautions, Mason became aware of undercurrents in the tribe's perception of his relationship with the chief's daughter. Some seemed to view his dedication to her recovery with approval. Others clearly suspected less honorable motivations. Nayeli herself maintained a careful balance, grateful for his help, friendly in their interactions, but never crossing the line into anything that might be construed as improper attachment. 1 month into Mason's stay, scouts brought news that changed everything. The Army had established a forward base just 30 miles north, well within striking distance of the winter camp. Captain Hollister had brought 2 companies of cavalry and a unit of infantry, with artillery expected to arrive within weeks. "They move earlier than expected," Red Sun said grimly when the tribal council gathered to discuss the development. "The passes should still be snowbound for at least another month." "Hollister is ambitious," Mason explained, having heard of the officer by reputation. "He wants a victory before spring campaigning season officially begins. It would guarantee his promotion." "How many men?" Tall Eagle demanded. "At least 200, based on the scouts' report," Mason calculated. "Too many for direct confrontation." The council descended into heated debate, with several war leaders arguing for immediate attack while the army was still establishing its position. Others advocated for abandoning the winter camp entirely, moving deeper into the mountains where the soldiers couldn't easily follow. Red Sun listened to all views before turning to Mason. "What would you do if you commanded these soldiers?" It was a test, Mason realized, of his loyalty, his judgment, his willingness to truly help the tribe rather than protect his former comrades. He considered carefully before answering. "I would send small patrols first, probing for resistance, mapping the terrain," he said honestly. "Standard procedure calls for establishing a perimeter of picket posts around the main camp. These would be vulnerable if approached carefully." "And then?" Red Sun prompted. "Once the area was secured, I would bring in the artillery. With that in place, I would send out larger search parties, sweeping methodically through likely locations for native camps." Mason paused. "The strategy would be to force you into either direct confrontation, where their numbers prevail, or flight into less habitable regions where winter would do their work for them." The blunt assessment silenced the council momentarily. Then Tall Eagle spoke. "We should strike first," he insisted. "Take their horse, burn their supplies, make it impossible for them to sustain their position." Several warriors voiced agreement, but Mason shook his head. "That's what Hollister expects and wants. He needs a provocation to justify a full-scale campaign. If you attack directly, even successfully, you give him exactly the excuse he needs to request more troops, more resources." "So we do nothing?" Tall Eagle challenged, anger edging his voice. "Wait for them to find us?" "No," Mason replied calmly. "You make them think you've done exactly what they expect, fled deeper into the mountains." He turned to Red Sun. "But in reality, you split your forces. The majority of women, children, and elders continue north as if the entire tribe is retreating. A smaller group, your best warriors, circles back to strike not at the soldiers, but at their ability to pursue." Red Sun's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Elaborate." Mason outlined a plan of systematic harassment, disrupting supply lines, creating false trails, using the Army's own procedures against them. "They expect you to behave like warriors," he concluded. "Instead, become ghosts." The council debated the strategy well into the night. Mason was eventually dismissed while the tribe's leaders continued their discussion in Apache. He returned to his lodge, uncertain whether his advice would be heeded or dismissed as the perspective of an outsider who couldn't possibly understand their ways. Dawn brought his answer. Red Sun summoned him as the first light touched the eastern horizon. "We will implement your strategy with modifications," the chief announced without preamble. The tribe will divide. Most will travel north today, toward the high summer grounds. Tall Eagle will lead 30 warriors to conduct the ghost warfare you described. Mason nodded, relieved his counsel had been valued. A wise decision. Red Sun studied him with penetrating intensity. There is one aspect we have not discussed. Your role in this. I assumed I would remain here, continue helping with Nayeli's recovery, Mason said, suddenly uncertain. My daughter will travel with the main group, Red Sun stated. Her safety is paramount. As for you, he paused, the silence heavy with significance. Tall Eagle has requested you accompany his warriors. Your knowledge of army procedures could prove valuable in the field. The request, or was it a command, caught Mason off guard. I've advised on strategy, he said carefully, but active participation in operations against U.S. soldiers is different. Yes, Red Sun agreed. It is a line once crossed that cannot be uncrossed. His expression remained unreadable. The choice is yours, Mason Thorne, but know this, trust, like respect, must be earned through actions, not words. The implication was clear. Mason's acceptance into the tribe, his continued protection, perhaps even his relationship with Nayeli, all hung in the balance of this decision. Yet forcing him to make the choice freely was itself an acknowledgement of his autonomy, his status as more than just a useful source of information. Before Mason could respond, the lodge entrance rustled and Nayeli entered. She moved with a walking stick now, her steps tentative but determined. The progress of the past month was evident in her upright posture, the newfound strength in her legs. Father, she greeted Red Sun, then turned to Mason. I heard the council's decision. Your father has just informed me of my options, Mason replied carefully. Nayeli's gaze was steady, betraying nothing of her thoughts on the matter. And what will you choose? Mason looked between father and daughter, understanding that this moment would define his place among them going forward. He had come to respect these people, to appreciate their struggle against forces that sought to erase them from existence. Yet actively participating in operations against soldiers, men not unlike those he had once led, crossed a threshold he had not anticipated. If I join Tall Eagle's group, he said slowly, I have one condition. No unnecessary killing. We target supplies, equipment, mobility, not men unless there is no alternative. Red Sun and Nayeli exchanged a glance Mason couldn't interpret. Then the chief nodded. Tall Eagle has agreed to this already. It aligns with our goal, to exhaust their will to continue, not to create martyrs for their cause. Relief coursed through Mason. Then I will go. A wise choice, Red Sun said, rising to his feet. Preparations begin immediately. You leave at midday. After the chief had departed, Nayeli moved closer to Mason, her walking stick tapping softly on the lodge floor. You're certain? She asked quietly. This changes everything for you. There will be no returning to your old life after this. My old life ended the day I found you behind that livery, Mason replied. Perhaps even before that, when my mother fell ill, or when I returned from the war carrying ghosts I couldn't shake. He met her gaze directly. I'm not certain of much anymore, Nayeli, but I am certain I can't stand by while Hollister destroys your people just to advance his career. She studied him for a long moment, then reached out and touched his face, the first time she had initiated such contact. Be careful, she said softly. Return safely. I still have many steps to take, and I would have you there to witness them. The simple statement carried weight beyond its literal meaning. Mason covered her hand with his own briefly. I'll do my best. The next hours passed in a blur of preparation. Mason was provided with Apache winter clothing, more practical for the mission ahead than his settler's garb. Grey Wolf showed him how to apply war paint that would break up the outline of his face, making him harder to spot in the forest. Weapons were distributed, ammunition counted, rations prepared. By midday, two distinct groups had formed at opposite ends of the camp. The larger comprised most of the tribe, packed and ready for the journey northward. The smaller consisted of Tall Eagle and his chosen warriors, their faces already painted for battle, their expressions grim with purpose. Mason stood with the latter group, feeling both out of place and strangely at home. These men had accepted him, grudgingly at first, now with cautious respect, because he had proven his worth through actions rather than words. Red Sun performed a blessing ceremony for both groups, praying for safe passage and successful endeavors. Then, as the tribe prepared to separate, Nayeli approached Mason one last time. She carried a small leather pouch, similar to the one that had held Eleanor's necklace. "Take this," she said, pressing it into his hand, "for protection." Mason opened it to find a carved stone eagle, simple but beautifully crafted, suspended on a leather cord. "Thank you," he said, immediately placing it around his neck. "It was my brother's when he went on his first war party," she explained. "It brought him home safely." The gift was significant, an acknowledgement of his status, a token of personal concern that went beyond mere alliance. Mason recognized it for what it was, Nayeli's way of saying what tribal custom might not allow her to express directly. "I will wear it with honor," he promised. Their farewell was brief. Necessity demanded it, and Apache culture discouraged public displays of emotion. Yet in the moment before they parted, something passed between them, an unspoken commitment to a future neither could yet clearly envision. As Tall Eagle led his warriors south toward the army encampment, Mason felt a strange sense of rightness settle over him. The path ahead was fraught with danger, the outcome uncertain. Yet for the first time since Gettysburg, he moved with clear purpose, unburdened by the weight of guilt that had been his constant companion for so long. Whatever came next, victory or defeat, life or death, he had finally found where he belonged. Not as the last man in an isolated valley, but as a bridge between worlds, fighting not for conquest or glory, but for something far more profound: the right of a people to exist, to maintain their way of life against forces that would destroy it in the name of progress. Mason Thorne, once hunter of deserters, had himself become something new. Not quite Apache, never again fully white, but something in between. A man reborn through choice and circumstance, walking a path neither he nor anyone else could have foreseen. As Tall Eagle led his warriors south toward the army encampment, Mason felt a strange sense of rightness settle over him. The path ahead was fraught with danger, the outcome uncertain. Yet for the first time since Gettysburg, he moved with clear purpose, unburdened by the weight of guilt that had been his constant companion for so long. 3 days of careful travel brought them to the ridgeline overlooking the Army's forward base. The warriors moved like shadows through the snow-laden forest, leaving barely a trace of their passage. Mason, despite his experience, struggled to match their absolute silence, though Grey Wolf nodded approvingly at his improvement. From their vantage point concealed among dense pines, Mason studied the encampment through a small brass spyglass he'd carried since the war. The military precision of the layout was familiar: concentric circles of defense, artillery positioned for maximum coverage, supply wagons arranged in neat rows. Tall Eagle crouched beside him, his dark eyes taking in every detail. "There," Mason whispered, handing over the spyglass and pointing. "The large tent in the center. That's the command post." As if on cue, a figure emerged from the tent, tall and straight-backed, with the distinctive bearing of a career officer. Even at this distance, the metals glinting on his uniform and the deference shown by the soldiers around him marked him clearly. "Hollister," Mason murmured, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air settling in his chest. He hadn't seen Captain James Hollister since Gettysburg, but the man hadn't changed much. The same imperious posture, the same meticulous attention to his uniform, the same habit of clasping his hands behind his back as he surveyed his domain. What had changed was Mason's perception. Once he had admired the man's efficiency and dedication. Now he saw only the cold ambition that would sacrifice an entire people for a promotion. Hollister paused to speak with a scout who had just returned to camp. The man gestured toward the northern mountains, the false trail the main Apache group had left. Hollister nodded, satisfaction evident even at this distance. He was taking the bait. Then, unexpectedly, Hollister turned and looked directly toward the ridge where Mason and the warriors were concealed. For a heart-stopping moment, Mason felt as though the captain's eyes found his, as though some sixth sense had alerted the officer to his presence. A memory flashed between them, Hollister giving the order that had sent Mason to the farmhouse. The order based on information that had proven tragically wrong. He cannot see us, Tall Eagle said softly, but he feels something. He is not a stupid man. No, Mason agreed, which makes him all the more dangerous. Hollister finally turned away, issuing orders to the officers around him. Preparations for a major movement were clearly underway, horses being saddled, rations distributed, weapons checked. The captain was planning to move soon, to pursue the phantom trail into the mountains. They will leave tomorrow at dawn, Tall Eagle observed, with many men, leaving fewer to guard the supplies, Mason pointed out, exactly as we hoped. As they withdrew from the ridge to rejoin the waiting warriors, Mason cast one last glance at Hollister. The captain stood alone now, studying a map spread before him, planning his campaign with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. Mason touched the stone eagle hanging at his throat, Nayeli's gift, and made a silent promise. This time the outcome would be different. This time he stood on the right side of history. That night, as the war party made cold camp in a sheltered ravine, Mason outlined their strategy. While Hollister pursued shadows into the mountains, they would strike at what he valued most, his reputation for success. We don't need to kill his men, Mason explained to the gathered warriors. We need to kill his certainty, his pride, his sense of control. That will defeat him more surely than any battle. Tall Eagle translated, and murmurs of approval spread through the group. It was a way of war they understood, the psychological dimension of conflict, the breaking of an enemy's will rather than merely his body. Grey Wolf, who had been the most skeptical of Mason's presence, spoke up. The white soldier speaks with two tongues, he said in halting English, surprising Mason. But this one speaks the true. I have watched. His heart is no longer divided. The simple acceptance meant more to Mason than the warrior could know. He nodded his thanks, unable to find words adequate for the moment. As they prepared for sleep, Tall Eagle approached. Tomorrow we begin, he said. Are you ready to become a ghost, Mason Thorne? Mason thought of Nayeli, of the future they might build if they survived this conflict. He thought of his mother, of her courage in crossing boundaries others feared to approach. He thought of Hollister, and all the men like him who saw the world only in terms of conquest and submission. Yes, he answered, I'm ready. Whatever came next, victory or defeat, life or death, he had finally found where he belonged. Not as the last man in an isolated valley, but as a bridge between worlds, fighting not for conquest or glory, but for something far more profound, the right of a people to exist, to maintain their way of life against forces that would destroy it in the name of progress. As the winter forest closed around the war party, Mason touched the stone eagle at his throat and allowed himself a moment of hope, not just for survival, but for a future where Nayeli would walk strongly beside him, where two worlds might find a way to coexist rather than destroy each other. It was perhaps an impossible dream, but as his mother had taught him through her own extraordinary life, the most meaningful journeys often began with what others deemed impossible. Summer had returned to the Montana mountains, the valleys lush with wildflowers and tall grasses that swayed in the warm breeze. At the edge of a meadow where forest met open land, Mason Thorne sat on a fallen log, carving a small wooden figure with practiced hands. His face was deeply tanned now, the scar that ran from temple to jaw no longer his most defining feature. Beside him lay his rifle, always within reach, but resting more often than not these days. From the ridge above, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made him look up, though he didn't reach for his weapon. He recognized the rhythm of that horse, knew its rider without needing to see. Nayeli appeared at the top of the ridge, sitting straight and proud on her pinto mare. No walking stick accompanied her now. The months of painful therapy, of falling and rising again, had strengthened her legs until she could ride and walk with only a slight limp to mark her past injury. She wore a mix of traditional Apache clothing and practical frontier garments, a buckskin shirt over canvas trousers, her hair in a single braid down her back, adorned with a silver ornament that caught the sunlight. She dismounted with fluid grace and approached Mason, her smile warming as she drew near. The traders have returned, she said without preamble. They bring news. Mason nodded, setting aside his carving. The network of traders who moved between native and white settlements had become their most reliable source of information about the wider world. A world that had declared Mason Thorne dead 6 months ago after the burned remains of a cabin had been found in his valley, along with enough personal effects to satisfy a cursory investigation. "What news?" he asked, moving to stand beside her. They didn't touch, not here in the open where young warriors might see. The customs of her people still governed their public behavior, though private moments held a different truth. "Captain Hollister has been recalled to Washington," Nayeli said, satisfaction evident in her tone. "The Apache campaign has been declared a costly failure." Mason couldn't help a grim smile. The ghost warfare strategy had worked better than even he had anticipated. For months, Tall Eagle's warriors, with Mason's guidance, had systematically dismantled Hollister's operation without ever engaging in direct battle. Supply wagons disappeared in the night. Horses were scattered, not stolen. Water sources were muddied, but not poisoned. Sentries found themselves bound and gagged at dawn, their weapons missing, but their lives spared. The army had been forced to expend enormous resources just to maintain their position, with nothing to show for it. No battles won, no territory secured, no glory for ambitious officers. "There's more," Nayeli continued. "A new Indian agent has been appointed to the territory, a man named Howard. The traders say he seeks negotiation, not conflict." "Can he be trusted?" Mason asked, the hard lessons of history making him wary of peace offerings from the government. "My father is cautious, but willing to listen." She paused, studying his face. "He wants you there when Howard comes to talk." The request didn't surprise Mason. In the months since he had first joined Tall Eagle's warriors, his status within the tribe had evolved from tolerated outsider to respected advisor. He had proven his loyalty during the campaign against Hollister, not just with strategy, but with actions, including a daring night raid where he had personally infiltrated the army camp to gather intelligence, risking hanging as a traitor if captured. "Of course," Mason agreed, "though I'm not sure how an army deserter's presence will help negotiations." "You are not just a deserter," Nayeli corrected him firmly. "You are seized beyond boundaries now. That is how my people know you." The name had been given to him in a ceremony 3 months earlier, after he had helped guide the tribe safely back to their summer grounds. It was an acknowledgement of his unique position, neither fully Apache nor white, but something new, something that could exist in both worlds and see value in each. "Besides," Nayeli added with rare mischief in her eyes, "the dead cannot desert." Mason chuckled, a sound that came more easily to him now than it had in years. Fair point. They walked together toward the ridge, leading her horse. The summer encampment spread below them in the valley, a circle of lodges, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing, women working at hide-stretching frames, men repairing weapons and tools, life continuing, adapting, enduring. "Sheriff Locke was asking about you again," Nayeli said after a comfortable silence. Mason raised an eyebrow. "What did he want?" "To know if your ghost still haunts these mountains." Her expression grew more serious. "I think he suspects you live, but says nothing." "No, he respects your choice." Mason nodded, grateful for the man's discretion. Locke had done what few would have, allowed justice to take precedence over law when the two conflicted. The sheriff maintained officially that Mason Thorne had likely died in the wilderness after fleeing his cabin. Unofficially, Mason suspected the man was relieved to have one less death on his conscience. As they neared the camp, several children ran toward them, calling Nayeli's name mixed with another. "Thorne who sees! Thorne who sees!" Mason knelt to their level as they approached, answering their rapid questions in the Apache tongue he now spoke with reasonable fluency. They wanted stories, always stories, about the world beyond the mountains, about the strange things white people built and believed. Later, he promised them, after council. Reluctantly, they scattered back to their games, some casting lingering glances over their shoulders. Mason watched them go, struck as always by how readily children accepted him, while adults remained more cautious even after all this time. "You should finish what you were working on," Nigeli said, nodding toward the small wooden carving he'd tucked into his belt. Mason took out the half-completed figure, a small eagle, wings spread in flight. "It's nearly done." "It's good," she said, studying it with critical eyes. "Better than your first attempts." "I had a patient teacher," he replied, thinking of the old man who had spent countless hours showing him how to work the wood properly, a skill passed down through generations. They paused at the edge of camp. Here, where others might see, they maintained the careful distance propriety demanded. But Nayeli's eyes held his a moment longer than necessary. "My father wishes to speak with us both before the evening meal," she said, "about the negotiations and other matters." Something in her tone caught Mason's attention. "What other matters?" A rare uncertainty crossed her face. "The elders have been talking about us." Mason felt a tightening in his chest. He had known this conversation would come eventually. Their growing closeness had not gone unnoticed in the tribe. Some approved, seeing it as a strengthening of bonds between worlds. Others worried about the dilution of bloodlines, the abandonment of the tradition. "Whatever they decide," Mason said quietly, "my path is chosen. I remain here, with or without their blessing." Nayeli's eyes softened. "The path is never as straight as we wish, nor as difficult as we fear." She touched the silver necklace at her throat, her mother's necklace, returned by Mason, now worn openly as her birthright. The circle finds ways to complete itself. As they walked the final distance into camp, Mason reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. From war-haunted recluse to bridge between worlds. From a man defined by guilt to one defined by purpose. The ghosts of Gettysburg no longer haunted his dreams as they once had. In their place were faces of the living. Nayeli walking unaided for the first time. Red Sun nodding in rare approval. Children gathering to hear his stories. Tall Eagle clasping his arm as a brother after their first successful raid. Mason's cabin in the valley was ash now, his old life officially ended. Yet he felt more alive than he had in years. He had found something he hadn't known he was seeking. Not just belonging, but purpose. In helping preserve the Apache way of life, he honored both his mother's legacy and his own rediscovered humanity. That evening, as firelight painted golden patterns across the gathered faces of the tribe, Mason sat in his designated place, no longer at the edges of the circle, but not quite in the center either. A place of his own making. Nayeli sat near her father, her back straight, her chin lifted with the dignity of her position. When her eyes met Mason's across the flames, they held a promise that transcended words. The impossible dream his mother had lived, of understanding across unbridgeable divides, had become Mason's reality. Not perfect, not without struggle, but real nonetheless. As Red Sun rose to open the council, Mason touched the stone eagle at his throat and silently thanked Eleanor for showing him the way home, though neither of them could have imagined where that path would lead. The last man in the valley had found his tribe, and in doing so had helped ensure they would endure.